Every empire you've ever learned about had a shadow. A story told only in whispers, buried beneath the marble and the monuments, the kind that kings ordered destroyed, that priests swore to forget. Tonight, we go looking for those stories, the ones that were never meant to survive. Close your eyes. The crowns are silent, but the dead are not. Before we begin, if you're new here, welcome. This channel exists for the nights when the world feels too loud and history feels too shallow. Hit subscribe and ring that bell so the next time you can't sleep, we'll be right here, waiting. There is a smell that history books never mention. It is the smell of power rotting, of silk and incense failing to cover something that cannot be covered, of a throne room sealed in the middle of summer, with the curtains drawn and the guards standing so still they might be statues, and somewhere behind the lacquered screen, somewhere in the stillness where no one is allowed to look, something that was once the most powerful man in the world is no longer quite a man at all. This is where our story begins. Not in a battle, not in a palace coup, not with a sword or a conspiracy or the dramatic fall of a dynasty. It begins with a smell and with a cart full of rotting fish. Let that sit for a moment. The year is 210 BCE. The Qin Empire, the first true unified empire in Chinese history, is 21 years old. It has been hammered into existence through 35 years of relentless military conquest, through a vision so vast and so violent that the man who carried it forward was forced to invent a new title just to contain it. He could not call himself a king. Kings were small. Kings were what came before. He called himself Huangdi, the first emperor, a word fused together from the names of the mythological god-kings of ancient legend, because he believed, with complete sincerity, that he had surpassed them all. His name was Ying Zheng, and by 210 BCE, he had unified 6 warring kingdoms, standardized the written language, standardized the currency, standardized the axle widths of carts, so that wheels would fit the same ruts on every road in a country the size of a continent. He had built the early foundations of what would become the Great Wall. He had begun construction on a mausoleum so enormous, guarded by an underground army of 8,000 terracotta soldiers, each with a unique face, each standing at attention in formation for a war that would never come, that it took 700,000 workers nearly 40 years to build. He had burned books. He had buried scholars alive. He had sent a fleet of ships east across the sea in search of a mythical island where immortal sages were said to possess the elixir of eternal life, because the one thing Qin Shi Huang wanted more than anything else in the world, the one thing he had not yet been able to conquer, was death itself. And death, of course, was not interested in negotiations. He died on the road. This is the detail that always catches people off guard. Not in his palace, not on his throne. He died on the 5th of his great inspection tours of his empire, somewhere in the flat, sweltering heat of what is now Hebei province, in a carriage, in summer far from the capital. The exact cause is debated. Mercury poisoning is the leading theory, which carries its own dark irony, because mercury was an ingredient in the immortality elixirs his court physicians had been feeding him for years, and so it is entirely possible that the thing he took to live forever is the thing that killed him. He was 49 years old. He had ruled for 37 years. He had never, in all that time, named an official heir. He had 2 sons traveling with the imperial procession. The eldest, a prince named Fuzu, was thousands of miles away, serving at the northern frontier. The younger, a boy named Huha, was right there in the convoy, and in that convoy, watching everything with very careful eyes, were 2 men. One was Li Si, the emperor's chief minister, one of the most brilliant and ruthless political architects in Chinese history, a man who had helped build the Qin state from the ground up, and whose entire existence depended on its stability. The other was Zhao Gao, a senior eunuch official, with enormous influence over the young Prince Huai, and ambitions that had no particular interest in stability at all. These two men looked at the dead emperor. They looked at each other, and they made a decision. They told no one, not the soldiers outside the carriage, not the ministers further back in the procession, not the cooks, not the servants, not the cooks, not the servants, not the thousands of people whose lives would be immediately and catastrophically affected by knowing that the man who had spent 40 years building the most powerful centralized government the world had ever seen was currently cooling in a lacquered carriage in the by-summer heat. They kept going. The procession continued exactly as before. The emperor's carriage moved with the convoy, curtains drawn, as it always was, because the emperor always traveled behind curtains. He was, famously, obsessed with secrecy and hated being seen in a state of repose or vulnerability, so the closed curtains raised no suspicion. The guards stood at their posts, the outriders kept their positions, and every morning Li Si or Zhao Gao would enter the carriage, and documents would be passed out, decisions would be passed out, decisions would be rendered. Officials would receive what appeared to be the emperor's judgment on whatever matter they had submitted. The empire kept running. The Son of Heaven kept ruling. From inside a box, what is almost impossible to fully absorb about this is the scale of the deception. This was not a small household keeping a quiet secret for a few days. This was the central government of a nation of perhaps 40 million people. This was the most bureaucratically sophisticated state on earth at that moment, a government that had specifically designed itself around the total centrality of one man. Every law, every appointment, every decision ultimately flowed through the emperor, and that emperor was dead, and the men who knew it were writing his edicts themselves, pressing his seal into the wax, sending instructions to generals and governors across the entire empire in the name of a ghost. The fish came in because of the smell. Summer in northern China is brutal. The body would have begun to decompose within hours. Within days, no amount of incense, and they used extraordinary quantities of incense, could have covered what was happening inside that carriage. And so, according to the historical accounts left by Sima Qian, China's great early historian who wrote about these events roughly a century later, the conspirators ordered that cartloads of salted fish be loaded onto the wagons that traveled nearest the imperial carriage. Salted fish has a powerful, pungent odor. Strong enough, they calculated, correctly, as it turned out, to explain away any other smell that might be noticed by people passing too close to the emperor's vehicle. The most powerful man in the world, hidden behind a curtain, covered by the smell of fish. There is something almost unbearably human about this. All the gold, all the armies, all the standardized weights and measures, and the terracotta soldier standing guard in the dark. And in the end, the thing that kept the empire running for another 51 days was a cartload of fish and two men with everything to lose. Because here is what Li Si and Zhao Gao understood, even if they understood it for entirely different reasons. The moment the emperor's death became public, everything would fracture. Not slowly, immediately. The Qin state was already hated by enormous portions of the population it had conquered and absorbed by force. The laws were brutal. The labor requirements were crushing. The punishment for even minor infractions could be death or mutilation. The only thing holding it together was the terrifying, near-mythological authority of the first emperor himself. A man who had ruled so completely and for so long that many of his subjects had never known any other world. Remove him from the equation, and you did not have a stable succession. You had a void. You had every ambitio, us general, every resentful noble, every suppressed kingdom that had been waiting for exactly this moment, suddenly looking at each other and asking the same question. Now, Li Si wanted to control the succession in an orderly way. By time we get back to the capital, install the right heir, preserve the system he had built. Zhao Gao wanted something more specific. He wanted Hu Hai on the throne because Hu Hai was young and impressionable. and Zhao Gao had been his tutor and companion since childhood, which meant that Hu Hai on the throne was effectively Zhao Gao controlling the throne. They forged a letter, in the emperor's name, addressed to Prince Fusu, the eldest son, the one who was thousands of miles away at the frontier, the one who had been groomed for succession, the one who was, by all accounts, gentle and principled and entirely unsuited to survive what was about to happen. The letter accused Fusu of disloyalty. It ordered him to commit suicide, and Fusu, because he was the kind of man who believed in following the orders of his father even when those orders destroyed him, did, just like that. The heir was gone, removed by a piece of paper, by a dead man's forged handwriting, by the ghost of an empire that had not yet realized it was already haunted. The procession reached the capital. The death was announced. Hu Hai was proclaimed the second emperor. Zhao Gao moved into the position he had engineered. Li Si found himself increasingly sidelined, then arrested on fabricated charges, then executed, which was, in the end, the fate of most people in proximity to Zhao Gao, because Zhao Gao's particular genius was the genius of the void, of making himself indispensable, by systematically eliminating everyone else who might be indispensable, and the Qin Dynasty, which the first emperor had proclaimed would last 10,000 generations, lasted 4 more years. 4 years, 10,000 generations down to 4 years. The rebellions came almost immediately, because the fear that had held the empire together was tied to one man's specific personal authority, and that authority had been dead since Haibai. The second emperor was a puppet and a disaster. Zhao Gao eventually had him killed too. A third emperor lasted 46 days before the dynasty collapsed entirely, and 2 of the rebellion leaders, one of them a former Qin official named Liu Bang, who would go on to found the Han Dynasty, were racing each other to the capital to see who got to define what came next. But go back. Go back to the carriage. Go back to the road in Hubei, to the curtains and the fish and the seal being pressed into wax by hands that were not the emperor's hands. There is a ghost story inside this history, and it is not a metaphor. Qin Shi Huang had spent the last decade of his life in a state of absolute terror about death, not in a quiet, private way, in an operatic, empire-consuming way. He had sent the fleet east. He had received reports back from the explorer Xu Fu, who took a fleet of thousands to find the islands of the immortals, that the immortality medicine was almost within reach, just a little more time, just a little more fending, just a little more faith. He had consulted alchemists and magicians. He had issued an edict forbidding his courtiers to even speak the word death in his presence. He had become increasingly erratic and paranoid, moving between his many palaces through a system of covered walkways so that no potential assassin could predict where he would be at any given moment, living a life of perpetual motion, perpetual secrecy, perpetual suspense. He was trying to outrun death by never being where it expected him to be. And death apparently found him anyway. What haunts this story, what makes it something more than a political thriller, something that settles in the bones on a quiet night, is the image of the court continuing, of the ministers approaching the carriage with their reports, speaking to the curtain, waiting for the response that would come back out through Li Si or a trusted attendant, and some of them, surely, having a feeling. A wrongness, not understanding what the wrongness was, but feeling it the wall. You sometimes feel that a room has changed before you can identify exactly how. The quality of the silence, the smell beneath the incense, beneath the fish, the way the responses came back slightly too smooth, slightly too consistent, none of the sudden irrational fury the emperor had been famous for in his later years, none of the paranoid digressions, none of the particular texture of a living mind. Were there people who suspected? Almost certainly. Did they say anything? No. Because saying something meant choosing a side in a succession crisis that had not yet officially begun, and in the Qin Empire, choosing the wrong side was a death sentence. And the safest thing to do when you sensed that something was profoundly wrong at the very center of the world you lived in was to keep your eyes forward and your mouth shut and hope that whatever was coming resolved itself before it reached you. And so the ghost ruled. For 51 days, the ghost issued decrees. The ghost received tribute. The ghost moved across the landscape of its own empire in a carriage with the curtains drawn, pulling everyone along in its wake, not through any supernatural power but through the sheer momentum of the authority it had built while it was alive. This is what empire does to a man. This is what absolute power costs. You build yourself so completely into the architecture of a civilization that and after you are gone, the civilization keeps running on the shape of you, keeps generating your signature, keeps speaking in your voice, keeps needing you so desperately that the people around you will go to extraordinary lengths to pretend you are still there. Because the alternative is chaos, and chaos is the one thing no one, from the highest minister to the lowest soldier, knows how to survive. Qin Shi Huang wanted to be immortal. He spent decades and vast fortunes trying to find a way to make it happen through medicine, through magic, through sheer accumulated power. And in the end, he got a version of it. 51 days of posthumous rule, 51 days of edicts and decisions, and the machinery of government grinding forward in his name, not because of any elixir, but because the men around him were more afraid of his absence than his presence. He haunted his own empire before anyone had time to mourn him. The terracotta soldiers are still there, standing in formation in the dark beneath the Shaanxi plain, 8,000 of them, waiting for a war that never came. The mausoleum above them has never been fully excavated, partly because of the technical difficulty, partly because of what the ancient texts say is inside. Rivers of mercury flowing in patterns shaped like the actual rivers of China, an underground map of the empire preserved in liquid poison, tests of the free, tests of the vols, soil above the burial mound have confirmed unusually high concentrations of mercury. The rivers are probably still there, still flowing in whatever slow subterranean way mercury flows, and the dark, in the shape of an empire that has not existed for 2,000 years, there is an argument to be made that he is still ruling down there, still at the center of things, still surrounded by his army, still issuing no decrees, still behind the curtain, still in the way that only the truly powerful dead remain powerful, shaping the world above him just by lying still in it. The cart of fish moved through the by-summer. The curtain stayed closed. The empire kept going, and somewhere behind the silk, in the heat, in the dark, in the smell that all the incense in China could not quite cover, the first emperor finished his last inspection tour. He would have approved of the silence. He always traveled this way. Sleep now. The road is very long, and the curtain is still closed. There is a sound that the old city makes at night, not the city as it is now, the Vespas and the tourists and the restaurants, spilling light and noise into streets that have been spilling light and noise for 3,000 years. Not that city. The other one, the one underneath, the one made of tufa and volcanic stone and compacted centuries, where the foundations of temples rest on the foundations of older. Temples rest on the foundations of things that were old before anyone thought to write down what they were. That city. In that city, at night when the ground is cold, and the air coming up through the grates smells of mineral water and deep thyme, there is sometimes a sound. It is very soft. It could be the wind finding its way through underground passages that have not been walked in 1,000 years. It could be the settling of stone under the incomprehensible weight of everything built on top of it. It could be water moving through channels that the Romans engineered so precisely that some of them still function, still carrying water to places that no longer have names. It could be all of these things. The soldiers who were stationed near the Forum in the later centuries of the empire had a different explanation. They did not talk about it openly, because soldiers are not supposed to talk about such things, and Roman soldiers especially were not supposed to talk about such things, because the Roman military identity was built entirely on the idea that there was nothing in this world or any other that a legionnaire could not face without flinching. But they talked about it anyway, in low voices, late at night, when the torches burned down to their last inch and the forum was empty, and the temples were just black shapes against the stars. They said it was weeping. They said it high, aimed from underground. They said it was the women. To understand what they meant, you have to understand what a Vestal Virgin actually was. Not the sanitized version, not the ceremonial role that gets described in history books in terms of robes and sacred fire and honorable public service, the real thing. The thing underneath the ceremony. A Vestal was selected between the ages of 6 and 10. The selection process was called the captio. The capture, which is a word that means exactly what it sounds like. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would review a list of candidates from noble families and point and say, "I take this one," and that child was taken, removed from her family. Not asked, not given a choice, not old enough to have a coherent understanding of what was happening. Only old enough to understand that the most important man in the religious life of Rome had pointed at her, and that her life had just changed in a way that could not be changed back. She would serve for 30 years. 30 years of absolute chastity, absolute religious duty, absolute public visibility. She would tend the sacred flame of Vesta, the flame that, according to Roman theology, was not merely symbolic but literally connected to the continued existence and safety of Rome itself. If the flame went out, the city would fall. This was not metaphor. This was doctrine. And so the Vestals tended it in shifts, through every night, through every storm, through every personal crisis or illness or grief, because the fire did not care about any of that, and neither, when it came to the fire, did Rome. In exchange for this, they received enormous privilege. A Vestal had legal independence at a time when Roman women were essentially legal non-persons, always under the guardianship of a father or husband or male relative. A Vestal could own property, make contracts, appear in court as a witness whose word carried exceptional weight. She had a front row seat at the games. Her litter had the right-of-way on any road in Rome. If she crossed the path of a condemned criminal being led to execution, the criminal went free. She was, in the precise theological language of Roman religion, a figure set apart, not quite mortal, not quite divine, something in the middle, something that Rome needed to keep in a specific, carefully maintained state. The maintenance of that state was enforced with absolute brutality. If a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the punishment was not execution. Execution would have been easier. The punishment was something the Romans had designed with great care to be as terrible as possible, while remaining technically within the rules of a theology that forbade the spilling of sacred blood. You could not kill a Vestal outright. She was too sacred for that. Her blood could not be shed, and so they found a way to end her that involved no blood at all. They buried her alive. The place was called the Campus Sceleratus, the field of wickedness, or in some translations, the accursed field. It was located just inside the Colline Gate, at the edge of the city, and it was there that a small underground chamber had been constructed. Not a cell, a room, a furnished room, because the Romans were precise about their theological mechanics, and the rules said that a Vestal's death could not be caused directly by human hands, could not involve the shedding of blood, and could not technically be a murder, and so what they gave her was a room with a lamp, a small amount of food and water, a couch, and a ladder that led down from the surface. She descended. The ladder was removed, the entrance was sealed, and Rome walked away. She had air for a while. She had the lamp, until the oil ran out. She had the food and water which would last a day or two, and then she had the dark, and the silence, and the stone, and whatever time remained between that moment and the end. The Romans did not think of this as murder. Legally, technically, it was not. Rome had given her sustenance. Rome had given her light, If she died in that room, it was because the gods had chosen not to intervene, and the gods' silence was its own verdict. Not frequently. Most Vestals served their 30 years and retired with honor and pension, and the right to marry if they wished, though few did. Because 30 years of being the most venerated woman in Rome is not an experience that makes ordinary domestic life seem appealing, but it happened. The historical record documents at least 10 cases in which a Vestal was tried for incestum, the violation of her vows, and condemned, and the historical record almost certainly undercounts, because the Romans were not always careful to preserve stories that reflected the more uncomfortable mechanics of their civilization. Some of the trials were almost certainly political. Rome was an intensely political city, and the Vestals, because of their privilege and their visibility and their access to powerful men, were sometimes caught in the machinery of factional struggle. A Vestal who had shown favor to the wrong senator, who had advocated for the wrong prisoner, who had simply become inconvenient in the wrong moment. These women were vulnerable in a specific way because the charge of unchastity was easy to make and very difficult to disprove. Since the standards of evidence in these trials were essentially whatever the Pontifex Maximus decided they were. Julius Caesar's own mother-in-law was a Vestal, and he was famously scrupulous about keeping his distance precisely because he understood how easily association could become accusation. The accusation, once made, had a momentum of its own. The trial was public, the humiliation was public, and then the procession to the Campus Sceleratus was public, because Rome had decided that the defilement of a Vestal was a threat to the entire city, a crack in the sacred architecture that held everything together, and the remedy needed to be witnessed by everyone. The condemned woman would be carried in a closed litter, completely covered, completely silent, through streets lined with people who watched without speaking, 'cause speaking at such a procession was bad luck. Another crack in the cosmic order, and Romans were very careful about cracks in the cosmic order. Think about what it was to be inside that litter, to know where it was going, to feel the movement of being carried through the city you had served, the city that had pointed at you when you were 7 years old, and said you, and had taken 30 years of your life in exchange for privilege and sanctity, and the knowledge that your specific existence mattered to the continued survival of civilization, and to know that the same city was now carrying you, in the dark, through its own streets, to a hole in the ground. Some of them, according to the ancient accounts, wept. Some of them called out. Tacitus and Plutarch and Livy all write about these processi, ons with a kind of careful restraint that suggests the writers themselves were unsettled by what they were describing, which is itself significant, because Roman historians were not generally unsettled by cruelty. Roman historians wrote about crucifixions and gladiatorial combat and mass slaughter with the calm precision of men who considered these things to be natural features of a functioning civilization. The Vestal processions got under their skin in a different way. There was something about the combination of sanctity and destruction, the taking of the most sacred woman in Rome and putting her in the most degraded possible situation, that the Roman mind, even the hardened Roman historical mind, found difficult to process cleanly. The underground chamber at the Campus Sceleratus no longer exists, or rather, it exists somewhere, because Rome does not truly destroy anything, it only builds on top of things. And whatever stone room the Romans constructed to receive their condemned Vestals is still down there in the geological layer cake beneath the modern city, filled with 2,000 years of accumulated sediment and darkness, sealed and forgotten, and sitting quietly under someone's foundation. The exact location is disputed by archaeologists. The site has never been definitively excavated, partly because the precise location of the calling gate itself is uncertain, and partly because excavating beneath modern Rome requires navigating a bureaucratic and logistical complexity that makes the Roman Senate look streamlined. But the soldiers knew where it was, and the soldiers in the long centuries of the empire, In the years when the old Republican religion was still technically operative, but was beginning to feel like a performance, even to the people performing it, the soldiers who were stationed near that part of the city talked about what they heard coming from the ground. Sound travels strangely underground. Anyone who has spent time in the catacombs or the older sewer systems beneath Rome will tell you this. A voice spoken in one chamber can emerge clearly in another chamber 50 meters away, channeled through stone passages with an acoustic precision that seems almost deliberate. The Romans knew this. They used it architecturally, built theaters and public spaces with conscious attention to how sound moved through stone. What they built underground, however, they built for other purposes, and the acoustic properties were incidental. And sometimes the sound that moved through the stone was not the kind of sound anyone had intended to transmit. The soldiers described it as soft, intermittent, coming and going with no predictable pattern, sometimes present for several nights in succession, sometimes absent for months. Not a scream, not anything, mega violent or dramatic, just a sound of someone who had been crying for a long time, who no longer had the energy for anything louder, who was simply making the sound that the body makes when it has run out of every other response to its situation. Several accounts describe legionnaires who refused their posting near the forum at night, which was an act of insubordination serious enough to result in punishment, and which therefore represents an interesting data point that there were men who considered the punishment for refusing a posting to be preferable to spending the night near whatever was making that sound. Military discipline in the Roman army was enforced with corporal punishment, and in extreme cases decimation. For a soldier to risk that rather than stand a night watch says something about the quality of what he was hearing. The theology is interesting here. Roman religion was enormously capacious. It had room for every kind of supernatural entity, every variety of spirit and demon and divine manifestation, and it had developed an extensive and nuanced vocabulary for the kinds of things that lingered after death. A larva was a malevolent spirit, usually the ghost of someone who had died violently or without proper burial rites. A lemur was the restless dead, the kind that came back because something in their death had been wrong, because they had been cheated of so. Meathing because the living owed them a debt that had not been paid. The Romans took lemurs seriously enough to have established a festival, the Lemuria, specifically designed to appease them, in which the paterfamilias of each household would rise at midnight, make a specific hand gesture to ward off evil, and throw black beans over his shoulder 9 times without looking back, saying, "I send these. With these beans I redeem me and mine," while the household spirits were believed to follow behind, collecting the beans as ransom for their departure. A Vestal Virgin who died underground, who had been put there by the city she had served, who had been given just enough sustenance to make her death not technically a murder, who had spent her final days or hours in a room that got darker and darker as the lamp oil ran out. This was exactly the kind of death that produced lemurs. The Romans would have understood this immediately. The soldiers would have understood it. Everyone would have understood that the theology they lived inside predicted precisely this outcome, that a woman who died like that, in that place, with that particular combination of sanctity and betrayal, would not go quietly. And yet the city built on top of it, and the next city built on top of that, and the next 7 or 8 cities deep now, layer upon layer of human habitation pressing down on the stone room with its extinguished lamp and its empty plate, and the ancient silence inside it. Sometimes, in the older parts of the city, you will step over a grate in the pavement and feel cold air coming up from beneath. The air smells of stone and water and age, of something that has been kept in the dark for a very long time. It is the breath of the undercity, the city that has not seen light since the empire fell, since the roads were buried, since the forums filled with rubble and the temples became churches, and the churches became ruins, and the ruins became foundations, and the foundations disappeared under the ordinary commerce of 2,000 years of people living their lives. Above a civilization they mostly forgot was there. Down there, somewhere under the steps of something that is now a car park, or a hotel, or an ordinary Roman piazza full of tourists eating gelato, there is a room, a small room, with a couch and a lamp that has been out for 2 millennia, and a plate that has been empty for 2 millennia, and a ladder that was never put back. And some nights, the accounts say, the old accounts, the ones written by men who had no reason to make it up, who were soldiers and historians and administrators, and who described what they heard with the same careful, practical Latin they used for everything else. Some nights, if you stood in the right place, at the height hour, when the city was quiet enough, you could hear Rome paying its oldest debt. Soft, intermittent, coming up through the stone, the fire burned for over 1,000 years. They kept it alive through every crisis, every invasion, every night. The last Vestal extinguished the sacred flame in 394 CE, when the Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of the pagan temples and the end of the ancient religion that had theoretically kept Rome safe for the entirety of its existence. Within 16 years, Rome had been sacked for the first time in 8 centuries. The Vestals, one imagines, would not have been surprised. Down in the dark, perhaps something that had been waiting a very long time simply nodded in the way that the betrayed sometimes nod when the truth finally arrives. Not with satisfaction exactly, not with anything as clean as satisfaction, but with the specific exhausted recognition of a wrong that has finally, after everything, been acknowledged by the world. The sound, after that, the soldiers said, stopped. Or perhaps there were simply no more soldiers to hear it. The city kept building. The walls kept their silence, and the fire at last went out. There is a kind of murder that takes longer than a lifetime. It does not require a weapon. It does not require proximity. It does not even require that the person you are killing still be alive. It requires only patty, ends, and tools, and an absolute conviction that a name, a specific arrangement of sounds that a specific human being has carried through the world, is the same thing as a soul. That to speak it is to summon it, that to carve it is to anchor it, and that to destroy it, carefully, systematically, stone by stone, and wall by wall across an entire civilization, is to do something far worse than kill a person. It is to unmake them. The ancient Egyptians had a word for this. Damnatio memoria is the Latin phrase historians use, borrowed from Rome, but the Egyptian concept was older and went deeper and was embedded in a theology so precise about the mechanics of death and afterlife that it had developed specific technical language for every possible variety of soul, every possible failure mode of the journey from life to whatever came after. The Egyptians were the great engineers of death. They spent more energy thinking carefully about what happened after you died than perhaps any civilization before or since. And what they concluded, after centuries of theological refinement, was this: you survived death only if you were remembered. Memory was not a comfort. Memory was not a tribute. Memory was the mechanism, the name, the image, the written record. These were not representations of a person. They were extensions of the person. They were the parts of you that could outlast your body, that could persist in the world of the living, and keep the connection open, keep the channel between the living and the dead from closing entirely. The Egyptians identified multiple components of the soul, each with its own function and vulnerability. The Ka was the vital life force, the animating energy that distinguished a living person from a corpse, which needed offerings of food and drink to sustain itself after death. Which is why tomb walls were covered in paintings of banquets and agricultural abundance, because the image of nourishment functioned as actual nourishment in the logic of Egyptian theology. The Ba was something closer to personality, the individual essence of a specific person, usually depicted as a human-headed bird that could travel between the world of the dead and the world of the living, that needed to be able to return to the body at night. Which is why the body needed to be preserved, why mummification was not vanity, but engineering. The Ak was the transformed, transfigured state that a successfully deceased person achieved after passing through judgment, the luminous, effective spirit, the version of you that had made it through. And then there was the Ren, the name. The Ren was not a label. It was not a convenience for other people to use when they wanted to refer to you. The Ren was a living component of your identity, as real and as essential as your heart or your breath, and it existed not just in your mouth but in every place where it was written or spoken. Every cartouche carved into every stone, every inscription on every statue, every papyrus that recorded your deeds or your titles or your prayers. Each of these was a node in a network, and the network was alive, and the network was you, and as long as any part of it survived, you survived. The name was the thing that called you into presence. The name was the thing that connected the dead to the living. The name was, in the most literal theological sense the Egyptians could express, the difference between existing and not existing. And so when an Egyptian pharaoh decided to destroy a predecessor, they did not merely tear down statues or erase faces from temple walls, though they did those things too. They went after the name. They went after every cartouche, every inscription, every place where the specific sounds of that specific person had been pressed into stone. They sent workers to every temple, every tomb, every monument in the entire country, with chisels and grinding stones and instructions that were absolute. Find the name. Remove it. Make the stone smooth. Make it as if the name had never been. Make it as if the person had never been. This was not vandalism. This was theology. This was an act of spiritual warfare conducted against someone who was already dead, designed to kill them again in the only way that actually mattered. Not the death of the body which was over and could not be undone, but the death of the Ren, the extinguishing of the name network, the cutting of every thread that connected the dead to the world that might have remembered them. Without the name, the Ka could not be nourished. Without the name, the Ba could not be nourished. Without the Ren, the path to the Ak was closed. The transformation could not complete, and what remained was not a person in any meaningful sense but a thing caught permanently between states. Not alive, not properly dead, not transformed, not gone. Just trapped. In the dark, in the silence where the name used to be. The Egyptians believed that the worst possible fate was not death. The worst possible fate was the second death. The death of the name, the death of memory, the state they called the death of the soul. And they believed that this state was not metaphorical, that somewhere in the geography of the afterlife, which they had mapped with extraordinary specificity in the Onduat and the Book of the Dead and dozens of other mortuary texts, there was a place where the nameless went, not a place of torment exactly, something worse, a place of pure negation, a non-place for non-people, where the unremembered went to be unremembered forever, without even the dignity of suffering, because suffering required a self to do the suffering, and the whole point was that the self had been dissolved. This is what was being done when the chisels came out. This is what was at stake. Not reputation, not legacy, the actual, literal, theological survival of a human soul. Now say the name Akhenaten. Go ahead, say it out loud if you want. It is a strange name by the standards of most pharaonic names, which tend to cluster around certain sounds and certain divine associations. And Akhenaten is strange in the way that everything about Akhenaten is strange. Slightly off-center, slightly jarring, announcing its own difference before you have even begun to understand what the difference means. He was born Amenhotep, the fourth pharaoh of that name, son of Amenhotep III, who ruled during one of the wealthiest and most stable periods in Egyptian history, inheritor of an empire at its height, with trade routes reaching as far as Mesopotamia and the Aegean and sub-Saharan Africa. He should have been a continuation. He should have been a refinement. He should have been the fourth verse of a song that everyone already knew. Instead, somewhere around the 5th year of his reign, he changed everything. He announced that the entire Egyptian religious system, the vast, ancient, deeply embedded theology of hundreds of gods, and their temples, and their priesthoods, and their priesthoods, and their preft, istivals, the system that had organized Egyptian civilization for nearly 2,000 years before him, was wrong. Not wrong in its details, wrong at its foundation. There was not a multiplicity of gods, he said. There was one. There was the Aten, the disk of the sun, the light itself, the physical solar energy that touched the world every morning and sustained everything alive, and Akhenaten, the name he gave himself, meaning something like effective spirit of the Aten, was the Aten's sole earthly representative, the only intermediary, the one through whom all contact with the divine had to pass. He closed the temples, not some of the temples, all of them. He disbanded the priesthoods. He redirected the enormous revenue streams that had flowed to the cults of Amun and Osiris and Ra and every other divine figure in the Egyptian pantheon, and pointed them at his new capital city, which he built from nothing in the desert, in a place where nothing had been before and nothing had wanted to be. A city called Akhenaten, the horizon of the 18, which we now call Amarna, and which rose from the sand with extraordinary speed. The entire administrative and religious apparatus of Egypt physically relocated to a place that Akhenaten chose specifically because it was uncontaminated by the presence of any previous deity, because the land itself was clean, because the new god deserved a new world. He sent the chisels out to every temple, every monument, every inscription in Egypt, but not to erase his own name, not yet. He sent them to erase another name, the name of Amun, the king of the Egyptian gods, the hidden one, the king of the Egyptian gods, whose priesthood had become so powerful and so wealthy over the preceding centuries that it had begun to function as a state within a state within a state, a parallel power structure that Akhenaten may have seen as a threat even before he saw it as a theological error. The name Amunen was chiseled from every stone in Egypt. Every cartouche, every inscription, every place where the god's name appeared in any context, including the names of people, including the name of his own father, Amenhotep, which contained the name of the god, had to be altered, even in his father's tomb, even on his father's monuments. The god's name was removed everywhere systematically, because in Egyptian theology, erasing a name was erasing a presence, and Akhenaten was trying to erase the presence of Amun from the world itself. He reigned for 17 years. He may have been many things: visionary, fanatic, revolutionary, madman. All of these, none of these, something for which there is no adequate single word. The art produced during his reign is unlike any other art in Egyptian history. Fluid, strange, almost tender, with a physical honesty about human bodies that the formal canon of Egyptian art had never permitted before, and which would never be permitted again. The famous busts and reliefs from Amarna show elongated skulls and wide hips and soft bellies, and there has been endless scholarly debate about whether these represent a medical condition, a deliberate artistic theology, a new visual language for depicting divine presence, or simply the style that the artists of Akhenaten developed in the particular atmosphere of a city built by a man who had decided to remake the world. The art looks like a dream, not entirely a comfortable dream. He died, and within a generation, Egypt erased him, his successor, possibly his son, possibly his son-in-law. The matter is complicated and the records are deliberately obscured, which is itself a consequence of what came next. Began the dismantling. Akhenaten was abandoned. The new capital was closed. The court returned to the old centers of power. The temples of Amun were reopened. The priesthoods restored. The revenues returned. The name of the god chiseled back into every surface where it had been removed. And then the chisels turned around. Everything Akhenaten had built was taken apart. The temples of the Aten were dismantled block by block. The blocks reused as fill material inside the foundations of other buildings. A specific kind of erasure, not merely destroying but inverting, using the stones, for the false religion as the hidden support structure of the true one, pressing them into the earth, burying them in the dark, where they could not be read. His statues were smashed, his images were defaced, his cartouches were chiseled from every surface in Egypt. His name, Akhenaten, was removed so thoroughly that within a few generations, the official king lists, the records of pharaonic succession that Egyptian culture may entirely, the years of his rule were attributed to his predecessors and successors. The books were made to add up without him. He was removed from the arithmetic of history, and his immediate successors, including the boy king whose tomb we know so well, whose name is almost certainly in your head right now, who came after Akhenaten and who very deliberately changed his own name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun to signal his return to the old religion, were careful to distance themselves from what had come before. The city in the desert was left to the sand. Within decades it was gone. Within a few generations, the people who lived nearest to the site had no precise idea what the ruins were. A place where something had happened once, a place with a strange energy, a place that did not encourage visitors to linger. And then, in 1887, a woman digging in the fields near the modern village of Tel El-Amarna found a collection of clay tablets. She did not know what they were. She sold them for a small amount of money. They passed through several hands. Some of them broke, some of them were lost, and eventually enough reached scholars to be recognized for what they were. The royal correspondence of Akhenat's court, letters sent to and from the kings of Babylon and Assyria, and Mitanni and Canaan, in the international diplomatic language of the era, recording the business of an empire that the official record said had not existed. The Amanar letters, a voice coming back through the silence, a name returning from the place where names go when the chisels have done their work. The excavations that followed over the next century, and more, found extraordinary things. They found the blocks of Akhenaten's temples reused in later foundations, pulled back into the light after 3,000 years of darkness, still bearing their inscriptions, still legible, the name still there in the stone where the erasure had, for one reason or another, been incomplete. They found the city under the sand, the outlines of the streets, and the great temple open to the sky, the houses of the officials and the artists, the workshop where the sculptor Thutmoses kept his models, concluding the most famous portrait in Egyptian art, the painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, Akhenaten's queen, found in a store, abandoned when the city was abandoned, left behind like a thought that someone had in the middle of a sentence, and then could not finish. Her face is unfinished. Her face is unfinished. The left eye has no iris inlaid. Scholars debate why. Was she still alive when the model was made, and the final details awaited her return for a sitting that never came? Was the incompleteness intentional, a marker of the model's working status? Did someone begin the finishing and stop for reasons that have not survived? The most famous face in Egyptian history looks out at you with one complete eye and one empty socket, seeing and not seeing, present and absent, finished and unfinished. This is what erasure does when it fails. It leaves things more present than before, more vivid, more necessary. The name that was supposed to vanish into the negation place where nameless souls go did not vanish. It went into the ground and waited. It waited in the reused stones, in the clay tablets, in the sand above the outlines of streets that official history said did not exist. It waited in the one unfinished eye of the most beautiful face in the ancient world. And it waited with a patience that put the patience of the men who sent the chisels out to shame, because those men were mortal, and their institutions were mortal, and their careful erasures were mortal, and the stone was not. Say it again. Akhenaten. The name that was, as supposed to be unmade. The wren that was supposed to be extinguished, to leave the soul trapped in the dark between states, non-existing in the non-place where the theology of erasure sent its victims. Every person who has ever said that name since its rediscovery is in the precise logic of the civilization that tried to erase it, performing an act of resurrection. Every cartouche reproduced in a museum catalog, every book, every documentary, every student who writes the name in an essay, and every tourist who reads it on a placard beside a fragment of limestone, pulled from the rubble of a foundation. All of them, without knowing it, without intending it, are feeding the K, are feeding the Ka, guiding the bad, doing the specific theological work that the priests of Ammon spent a generation trying to prevent. The name survived. The soul, by the logic of the civilization that condemned it, survived, not despite the erasure, but almost because of it. Because the very thoroughness of the attempt, the obsessive completeness of the chiseling, the lengths to which Egypt went to make this one man's existence disappear, is precisely what made him impossible to forget. You do not spend that much effort erasing something ordinary. The scale of the erasure is itself a monument. The empty spaces in the stone are themselves a kind of inscription, a negative image of a name that the stone remembers even when the letters are gone. The Egyptians understood that names were alive. They understood that names could die. What they perhaps did not fully account for was that names, like certain seeds, can survive conditions that should kill them. That the darkness of the negation place, the silence of the erased stone, is not always an ending. Sometimes it is a waiting. Sometimes it is just a very long night before a morning that the person doing the erasing did not live to see. The horizon of the Aten, that is what the name of his city meant, the place where the sun disk touched the earth. The horizon is where things disappear. The horizon is also where they return. He built his city on the horizon and they erased it, and the sand covered it, and 3,000 years later the stones came back up out of the earth, and the name came with them, intact, alive, spoken now in 100 languages by people who will never stand in the desert where the city was, who will never feel the particular quality of light in that particular place, who know nothing of the theology that made a name a soul and an erasure a murder. They say it anyway. Akhenaten, there, it is said, somewhere in the Egyptian dark, in whatever geography the engineers of the afterlife constructed for the souls of their dead, something that has been waiting a very long time may have just heard its name called back into the world. It is still listening. It was always listening. The stone remembers everything. There is a moment, just before midnight, when a crossroads changes. You have felt this, maybe, without having the language for it. That particular quality of stillness that settles over an intersection when the foot traffic has thinned, and the torches are burning low, and the city around you is making the specific sounds of a city that is almost but not quite asleep. That moment when the geometry of the crossing, 4 directions meeting, 4 choices radiating outward into the dark, feels less like a feature of the urban landscape and more like something that was designed by a force that does not have human convenience as its primary concern. That moment when you find yourself walking a little faster, not because you have heard anything, not because you have seen anything, but because something in the oldest part of your nervous system has issued a recommendation, politely but firmly, that this particular spot is not somewhere you want to be standing still. Every culture that has ever built roads has understood that crossroads are dangerous, not physically dangerous, or not only physically dangerous, but cosmologically dangerous, places where the ordinary rules of the world become temporarily negotiable, where the membrane between what is seen and what is unseen develops a thinness that the things on the other side of it can exploit. The Greeks left offerings at crossroads for Hecate. The Romans buried certain categories of the dead at crossroads to prevent them from finding their way home. The West African traditions that traveled across the Atlantic in the bodies of enslaved people gave us the crossroads where deals are made with entities you do not want to meet in any other context. The medieval Europeans believed that suicides, buried at crossroads with stakes through their hearts, would be confused by the multiple directions and unable to find their way back to haunt the living. Something about the place where paths cross has always felt to the human mind in every time and every culture, like a door that is not entirely closed. The Mexica people, whom we call the Aztecs, built their capital city of Tenochtitlán on an island in a lake, connected to the mainland by great causeways, organized around a sacred center from which everything radiated outward in a cosmological geometry so precise that the city itself was a diagram of the universe. They were engineers of extraordinary sophistication, farmers who built floating gardens on the surface of the lake, astronomers who tracked the movements of Venus with an accuracy that took European science centuries more to achieve, theologians who had thought more carefully and more systematically about the structure of time and fate and divine will than most, civilizations that called themselves philosophically advanced. And they were by the standards of almost any moral framework you care to apply, living inside a cosmology of relentless grinding danger. The Aztec universe was not stable. It was not a place in which things continued, because continuation was the natural state of affairs. It was a place that existed only because it was constantly, laboriously at tremendous cost, being kept in existence by the actions of human beings whose participation in the cosmic maintenance project was not optional. The sun rose every morning not because the sun simply rose every morning, but because the correct things had been done to ensure that it would. The rains came not because rain was reliable, but because the relationship between the human and the divine had been properly maintained. The crops grew, the empire continued, the world did not end. Not because these were defaults, but because they were achievements, renewed every day, every ceremony, every sacrifice, at the cost of blood and effort and an absolute refusal to take anything for granted. Within this cosmology, death was not one thing. Death was an enormous differentiated taxonomically precise landscape, and where you went after you died, and what you became after you died, depended entirely on how you died, not on how you lived, not on your moral character or your achieving nets or your relationships or any of the criteria that other theologies used to sort the dead. The Aztecs sorted by cause of death, and the sorting was absolute, and the destinations were specific, and some of them were very much better than others. Warriors who died in battle went to the Eastern Paradise, the House of the Sun, where they became hummingbirds and butterflies and escorted the sun from the horizon to its zenith every morning in a procession of light and color. 4 years of this, and then they returned to the world as hummingbirds. Which is why, in Mexican folk tradition persisting to this day, you do not harm a hummingbird, because it might be a soldier ancestor. People who drowned, or were struck by lightning, or died of water-related diseases went to Tenochtitlán, the paradise of the rain god, a warm green place of abundance and ease. Infants who died before they could eat solid food went to a special realm where a tree dripped milk from its branches because they had not lived enough to earn anything else, and the universe had decided to be gentle with them. And women who died in childbirth went somewhere else entirely. They became the Cihuateteo. The word means, roughly, divine women, or goddess women. The teteo suffix, indicating divine status, the Cihawa indicating femaleness, and the combination indicating something that is both and is therefore more dangerous than either alone. Because the Cihuateteo were not honored dead. They were not ancestors to be revered from a comfortable distance. They were something that occupied the theological space between goddess and monster, something that had been elevated by their death to a kind of terrible power that the living needed to treat with extreme care. The Aztecs understood dying in childbirth as the equivalent of dying in battle. The laboring woman was a warrior. The child she was trying to bring through was the prize. The captive, the thing that the battle was for. If she died in the attempt, she had fallen in combat as surely as any warrior cut down on a field of war, and so she received a warrior's afterlife. But the women's version of it, which was not the Eastern Paradise, but the Western one, and not the morning journey of the ascending sun, but the afternoon journey, the long slide from zenith to horizon, the part of the day when the light is still strong but already beginning to feel the pull of the dark below. For 4 years the Cihuateteo escorted the sun from its highest point to the western horizon, just as the male warriors escorted it up from the east. After 4 years they descended, and when they descended, they came back to the world, not as hummingbirds, not as something gentle and bright, but as something that carried the full weight of what their death had cost them. They came back hungry. They came back angry, though that is perhaps not the precise word. The Aztec theological vocabulary for the emotional states of the divine dead is more complex than anger, more specific, more about a kind of cosmic imbalance than a personal emotion, about a force that has been disrupted from its proper flow and is now seeking to restore equilibrium in ways that do not take human welfare as a primary consideration. They came to the crossroads specifically, always because crossroads were the liminal places, the between places, the spots in the human geography of the city where the structure of ordinary life thinned enough for the returning dead to push through. They came at night because night was their domain. The Cihuateteo were associated with the western dark, with the direction from which they had descended, with the hours when the sun was absent and the cosmic protection that daylight provided had temporarily withdrawn, and they came for children. The specific targeting of children, rather than adults, rather than any vulnerable human, specifically children, is one of the details of this belief system that requires sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to read it as simple predatory menace and miss the theological structure underneath it. The Aztec universe ran on correspondence and exchange, on the idea that things of similar sacred weight could substitute for one another, that the cosmic accounts had to balance. A woman who had died trying to bring a child into the world had been cheated of something specific, not life in general, but the particular outcome of that specific battle. She had fought for a child and lost the child or the fight, or both, and so what she came back seeking was not random. It was proportionate. It was the thing that had been taken from her, in the only form in which the universe's logic of exchange could restore it. Children who wandered out at night, who were out of their homes after dark for any reason, but especially children who were out near crossroads, near the liminal places where the Cihuateteo touched the world, were in specific, named, theologically understood danger, not danger in the way that a city at night is simply physically dangerous. Danger in the precise sense that the entity they might encounter had a specific claim on them, a cosmological grievance that the universe itself had validated, and that the only thing standing between the child and the claim was the vigilance of the living adults responsible for keeping them inside. The Cihuateteo were not subtle. The accounts described them as strikingly visible. White-faced, chalk-pale in the darkness, with their arms stretched forward, the posture of women in the later stages of labor, reaching, always reaching, in a gesture that is at the same time an offer and a demand. Their faces are described as skull-like, the flesh of the birth battle still on them, the wounds of the dying that brought them to this state both hidden and visible, in the specific way that the Aztec art of divine beings made the terrible and the beautiful into the same face. Their hands have claws in some of the iconographic representations that survive, which seems contradictory, the mother's reaching hands and the predator's claws in the same gesture, until you understand that for the Cihuateteo, these were not contradictions, they were the same thing. The love and the taking were the same motion. The hunger and the grief were the same force. The stone images that survive, and several do, remarkable objects in museum collections in Mexico City and elsewhere, show a particular combination of the maternal and the monstrous that is difficult to look at without feeling the specific chill of something that has been precisely designed to unsettle. The face is a skull wearing the expression of a mother. The body is a divine woman wearing the posture of a corpse. Everything about the iconography says, this is something that used to be one thing and is now something else, and the transition between the two states was not clean, and the unclean edges of it are exactly where the danger lives. The 5 most dangerous nights of the Aztec calendar were the 5 days associated with the Cihuateteo, the Tenochtitlán, the 260-day sacred calendar that ran alongside the solar year, the calendar that governed omens and fate, and the sacred weight of each specific day, had 5 days that belonged specifically to the returning divine women. 1 rain, 1 flower, 1 monkey, 1 house, 1 eagle. On these nights, the crossroads were avoided entirely by anyone with any choice in the matter. Parents kept their children inside with a seriousness that went beyond ordinary caution, because ordinary caution was a human-scale response to a human-scale threat, and the Cihuateteo were not a human-scale threat. On these nights, offerings were left at the crossroads: food, small objects, things that might satisfy the hunger or acknowledge the grievance, or simply communicate to the divine women that the living were paying attention, were not taking their presence for granted, were performing the correct rituals of acknowledgement that the cosmic relationship required. Because this is the other side of the Cihuateteo, the side that gets lost when the story is reduced to simple ghost story terms. They were not simply malevolent. They were powerful. They were divine. They had earned their status through the specific valor of their deaths, and the Aztec world, which was not a world that looked away for the cost of things, which had built its entire civilization on an explicit acknowledgement that existence required sacrifice and sacrifice required honesty about what was being given up, honored that valor even while fearing its consequences. The women who became Cihuateteo were mourned. The rituals surrounding their deaths were specific and elaborate, designed to both honor their warrior status and manage the transformation that was coming. The midwife who attended a woman who died in childbirth had to guard the body carefully, because the moment of death was also the moment of becoming, and the transition was believed to carry its own power that the living needed to contain and direct correctly. The body of a woman who died in childbirth was buried at the crossroads, not as a punishment, as a placement, as a recognition that this was where she now belonged, where her power would be properly located, where the living could come to acknowledge her, and where she could exercise her new nature in the place that was appropriate for it. The body was guarded on the night of burial by young warriors, because other people, specifically, according to the sources, sorcerers, and people who practiced the darker edges of Aztec ritual medicine, were believed to want pieces of the body, the left forearm in particular, because the body of a Cihuateteo carried within it the power that the woman had accumulated through her death, and that power had practical applications for people whose work required access to the kind of force that crossed boundaries. The left forearm specifically, because the left side was the night side, the western side the direction of the dead and the dark and the powerful, and the arm was the part of the body that reached, that extended toward what it wanted, that enacted the gesture that was the signature of the Cihuateteo. And every image and every account, there is something in all of this that goes beyond theology, that touches something in the emotional architecture of a civilization, trying to find a language for things that resist easy language. The Aztec world was one in which death in childbirth was common, not tragically unusual, common. A predictable, recurring feature of ordinary life, something that every family, every community, every generation encountered not once but many times. The women who died this way were not anomalies. They were the ordinary dead, the everyday cost of the most fundamental human activity, and they left behind infants who needed to be fed, and husbands who needed to continue, and families that needed to absorb the loss and keep going, and they left behind grief, the specific, complicated grief of a death that happened at the moment of creation, that tangled the loss of the mother with the arrival of the child, that made every subsequent moment of the child's life a kind of archaeological site where a different life, the mother's continued life, was buried somewhere underneath. The Aztec cosmology took that grief and gave it a form, a face, a calendar, a specific behavior pattern, a set of ritual responses that acknowledged the reality of the loss without pretending it was simple. The Cihuateteo were the shape that grief took when it was too large and too divine to remain grief. They were the women who had not finished, who had been stopped in the middle of the most important thing they had ever done, pulled out of the story before the ending, left with the momentum of the attempt still in them, and nowhere for it to go. And so it went toward the crossroads. And so it went toward the children. And so it reached, always reaching, in the gesture that was a labor reaching, and a mother reaching and a dead woman reaching, and all three of these at once. Because the Aztec mind did not require its divine powers to be only one thing, the causeways of Tenochtitlán were wide enough for 10 people to walk abreast. The city at its height had 200,000 people, possibly more, a population that exceeded every European city of the same era. The crossroads where the Cihuateteo gathered on their 5 sacred nights were in the middle of all of this, in the middle of a functioning, sophisticated cosmopolitan urban center that had markets and schools and aqueducts and a judicial system and neighborhoods sorted by profession and elaborate botanical gardens and a zoo. And in the middle of all of it, on 5 nights out of 260, the city kept its children inside and left food at the intersections and did not look too carefully at the pale figures that the accounts say could be seen at the crossing of the roads, arms extended, turning slowly, as if looking for something they had misplaced and could not stop searching for, as if the thing they had been reaching toward at the end, at the moment that made them what they became, was still somewhere just out of reach, as if the battle had never quite ended, as if some part of the dying had never gotten the message that the dying was done. Tenochtitlán is gone now. The lake was drained. The causeways are avenues. The temples are under cathedrals. The canals are under streets. The floating gardens are under the southern neighborhoods of a city of 9 million people that grew on top of the island in the lake, where the Mexica built their diagram of the universe. The crossroads are still there. Every city has crossroads, and on certain nights, in certain lights, in that particular hour, when the city is almost but not quite asleep, there is still that moment. The one you know without knowing how you know it. The one that Kez, the oldest part of you, recommend, politely but firmly, that you keep moving. The Cihuateteo are gone, perhaps, or perhaps they are simply waiting for the 5 days that belong to them. Perhaps they are at every crossroads in every city that grew on top of a city that grew on top of a city that grew on top of a city that grew on top of the place where women died reaching toward the thing they almost had. Perhaps the reaching never stops. Perhaps that is the point. Keep walking. Do not look back at the intersection. Do not wonder what is turning slowly, in the space where the 4 roads meet. Do not stop. Not tonight. The crossroads are behind you now. You are safe. Sleep. There is a particular quality of silence that only sealed rooms have. Not the silence of an empty room, which is merely the absence of sound, which any room achieves the moment its occupants leave. This is different. This is the silence of a room that has been deliberately cut off from the world, whose door has been mortared over, whose windows have been filled with stone, whose every connection to the living city around it has been methodically, permanently closed. This is a silence that has been manufactured, engineered, imposed on a space with the same intention and effort that other spaces are given light or air or warmth. Someone decided that this room would be silent, and someone did the work to make it so, and then the world moved on and the room stayed exactly as it was left, and the silence inside it deepened every year, layer upon layer of absolute quiet pressing down on whatever was inside, until the silence itself became a kind of presence, a kind of substance, almost a kind of sound, when workers excavating beneath the foundations of what had once been the great palace of Constantinople broke through a wall in the early decades of the 20th century and found a chamber that had not been opened in approximately 800 years. The first thing they reported, before they described what they saw, before they catalogued the objects, before any of the careful archaeological language of documentation began, was the silence. They said it came out of the room like something physical, like a breath held for 8 centuries finally released, like the room exhaling everything it had been keeping. Constantinople is a city of layers in a way that even Rome, even Cairo, struggles to match. It sits at the hinge of two continents. It sits at the hinge of two continents. At the narrow throat where Europe reaches toward Asia across a strip of water so strategically significant that every major power in the ancient and medieval world either controlled it or spent enormous resources trying to. The city that Constantine founded on the bones of the older Greek colony of Byzantium in 330 CE was designed from its first foundations to be the center of the world, and for 1,000 years it made a reasonable argument for that claim. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, Empire, what we call Byzantium, though its inhabitants called themselves Romans, and their emperor the legitimate successor of Augustus, and their city the New Rome, and none of them would have recognized the word Byzantine as a description of themselves, lasted 1,000 years after the Western Empire collapsed. 1,000 years of court ceremony so elaborate it had been codified into manuals, hundreds of pages long. 1,000 years of theological controversy so intense that arguments about the precise nature of Christ's divine and human natures generated riots that killed people in the streets. 1,000 years of palace politics so complex and so lethal that the word Byzantine has entered English as a synonym for labyrinthine intrigue, for complication so total that the complication itself becomes the point. 1,000 years is a long time to build on top of things. A long time for the city to rise, layer upon layer, the new structures incorporating the old structures disappearing into the new foundations, rooms and corridors and entire wings of enormous buildings sealed off and forgotten, as the palace complex expanded and contracted and was rebuilt and modified and expanded again. Over the course of 10 centuries of imperial occupation, the great palace alone, not a single building but an enormous complex of interconnected structures, spreading across the first hill of the city toward the shores of the Marmara Sea, was added to and altered by so many different emperors over so many centuries that no complete plan of it has ever been reconstructed. We have descriptions, we have the accounts of foreign visitors who were received there and who recorded their impressions with the slightly dazed quality of people trying to describe something that exceeds their descriptive vocabulary. We have fragments. We have floor mosaics, some of them extraordinary, preserved by the same process that preserved everything in Byzantine Constantinople. By being buried, by being covered, by being sealed away from the air and the light and the ongoing human appetite for reusing good building material. We do not have the palace. The palace is gone in the way that only the things at the absolute center of a lost civilization go, not gradually, not partially, but comprehensively. The Ottoman conquest of 1453 reshaping the city so thoroughly that the physical fabric of the Byzantine imperial world was absorbed and transformed and built over until finding it requires the kind of patient, painstaking excavation that treats every layer of soil as a text to be read, rather than an obstacle to be cleared. And some of it has been found. And some of what has been found. And some of what has been found are, as questions that the physical evidence alone cannot answer, and that the historical record only answers in fragments, and that the human imagination, in the absence of better options, has been filling in for centuries with stories. The story of the empress in the walls is one of those stories. It is also possibly something more. To understand it, you have to understand what it meant to be an empress in Constantinople, not what it meant in terms of ceremony or title or the specific weight of the crown on a specific head, though those things mattered enormously, and the Byzantine court had developed an understanding of the power of ceremony, of the way that ritual enacts and sustains the reality it appears merely to be representing. That was sophisticated enough to be studied by political theorists 1,000 years later. You have to understand what it meant in terms of survival, in terms of the specific calculation that anyone who occupied, or was adjacent to, the Byzantine imperial throne had to perform every day of their lives. The Byzantine Empire killed emperors. This was not an aberration or a sign of systemic failure. It was, by a certain reading, the system functioning as designed, a brutal but effective mechanism for removing rulers who had lost the mandate of their court and their army and their people, a circulation of power that, however bloody, prevented decay. End of total dynastic ossification that could lock an incompetent ruler in place for decades. Between 395 CE and 1453 CE, the Eastern Empire had over 80 emperors. Of those, roughly one-third were deposed, and of those, a substantial portion were blinded, mutilated, exiled, imprisoned, strangled, stabbed, poisoned, or thrown into the sea. The Byzantines had developed blinding specifically as an imperial punishment because it was understood to disqualify a man from the throne. A perfect emperor required a perfect body, and a blind man could not rule, which made it a way of removing a rival without creating a martyr, without the theological and political complications of imperial murder. It was considered merciful. This tells you something about Constantinople. The empresses existed inside this system and were not exempt from it. Some of them exercised extraordinary power. Theodora, wife of Justinian, who came from the circus and may have worked as a prostitute before she became the most powerful woman in the world, and arguably co-ruled the empire that bears her husband's name. Irene, who had her own son blinded and deposed and ruled alone, the first woman to do so, taking the masculine title of Basilius rather than the feminine Basilissa, because there was no framework for what she was. Zoe, who ruled twice, who was exiled and brought back and married 3 times after the age of 50, and whose face looks out from a mosaic in Hagia Sophia with the specific expression of a woman who has survived things that would have destroyed most people and has opinions about it. These women were powerful, and they were targets, and they lived inside a court where the distance between the throne and the dungeon, between the crown and the sealed room, was measured not in physical space, but in the shifting allegiances of generals and eunuchs and churchmen whose loyalty was always contingent. The legend attaches itself to different empresses depending on which version you encounter, which century of Byzantine history the teller is drawing from, which of the many political catastrophes of the empire's long decline they are using as their setting. The core of it is consistent: an empress or a woman of imperial blood, or a woman with a claim to imperial power that made her dangerous to whoever currently occupied the throne, was taken to a room in the deepest part of the palace complex and left there. Not executed, not executed, not executed, not blinded or mutilated, or given the formal degradation of a deposition ceremony, stripped of titles and robes in the sight of the court, simply placed in a room and left there. And the room was sealed, and she was not executed because executing her would have created the complications that the Byzantines had spent centuries developing creative alternatives to avoid. And she was not released because releasing her was equally impossible, and so the solution was the room. The crown, in the versions that have persisted most stubbornly, stayed on her head. This detail seems almost theatrical, almost too Gothic to be credited, until you understand what a Byzantine imperial crown actually meant, not as decoration but as theology. The crown was not merely a symbol of authority. It was understood to participate in the divine sanction of imperial rule, to be in some sense inhabited by the sacred authority it represented. To remove the crown in the formal deposition ceremony was to make a theological statement about the withdrawal of divine favor, and if no formal deposition ceremony had been performed, if the empress had simply been sealed away, if the court had decided that the most convenient way to handle her was to pretend that the question of her status never formally arose, then the crown stayed, because removing it without ceremony was its own kind of statement, one that the people who had sealed the room were not prepared to make officially. She was there, in the room, still crowned, technically still empress, technically still in possession of the divine sanction that the crown represented, in a room that was being filled in around her with stone and mortar, while she was still alive to hear it. The Byzantine Byzantine sources are fragmentary and often deliberately obscure about the fates of politically inconvenient women. The court chronicles that survive were written by men who were themselves navigating the same political currents they were describing, and who had strong incentives to record certain things, and equally strong incentives to leave other things unrecorded. To mention a woman's disappearance from the historical record without inquiring too carefully into the mechanics of the disappearance. She withdrew from public life. She retired to a convent. She was taken ill. She went to the palace of her family. The chronicles offer these explanations with a smoothness that is itself a kind of evidence. The smoothness of a surface that has been deliberately planned, that has had its grain removed so that nothing catches, nothing snags, nothing invites the reader to push against it. The women who were sealed in rooms do not appear in the chronicles. That is the point of the rooms, but the rooms appear in the archaeology. The sealed chambers in the foundations of the great palace, and there are more than one. The excavations of the 20th century found several spaces that showed signs of deliberate sealing without obvious functional explanation, without the markers of storage or structural reinforcement that might account for a mortared-over doorway in any other context. These rooms, said, existed. They were sealed for reasons. The reasons were not recorded in the chronicles, and the objects found in some of them were not the objects of abandoned storage. They were the objects of abandoned life, personal items, the kind of thing that ends up in a room because a person brought them there, not because someone was tidying. One chamber, smaller than the others, showed evidence of habitation that was difficult to account for in any functional architectural context. A space too small for storage, too removed from any logical pathway through the palace complex to have served as a passage or antechamber, showing the marks on its stone floor of what might have been furniture, or might have been the wearing down of stone, by someone moving repeatedly over the same small area, back and forth, in the way that confined creatures move when the confinement has gone on long enough, that movement itself has ceased to be purposeful, and become simply the thing that the body does, because it has forgotten how to be still. In the debris of centuries that had accumulated in this chamber, mixed with the sediment and the detritus of 800 years of sealed darkness, there were traces of gold thread, the kind used in Byzantine imperial textiles, the kind woven into the robes and the regalia of the highest levels of the court, the kind that does not end up in a sealed basement room by accident, that is not misplaced or discarded, that arrives in a place because a person wearing it was brought there and did not leave. The crown itself was not found. The crown, if there was a crown, is either somewhere deeper in the debris layers that were not fully excavated, or was removed at some point in the 800 years between the sealing and the opening, or was never there in the way the legend describes it, was added to the story later, as stories always accumulate details in the direction of their own most powerful image, the image that makes the listener's chest tighten. The most powerful image here is obvious. You do not need to be told what it is. You are already seeing it. A woman, alone, in a room that is getting smaller. Not physically smaller. The walls are not moving, but smaller in the way that sealed spaces become smaller as the air thickens and the lamp burns down, as the sounds of the palace above her. The footsteps and the voices and the machinery of the court, that had been her entire world, become first muffled, and then distant, and then absent, as the silence accumulates. Wearing her crown because no one has taken it, wearing her crown perhaps because it is the last thing she has, that connects her to the woman she was before the room, the woman who sat in the court and received ambassadors, and spoke in the language of power, and occupied, however contingently, however dangerously, the highest position available to a woman in the most sophisticated civilization of the medieval world. The crown on her head in that room is the last argument, the last claim, the last insistence that the woman in the sealed room and the empress in the throne room are the same person, that what has been done to her does not change what she is, that the sealing of the room is not the same as the performance of the deposition ceremony, that somewhere in the theological and political architecture of the empire there is still a live question, still an unresolved status, still a version of events in which the door could be reopened and she could walk out and the crown would mean exactly what it meant before. She was kept alive for some time. The food provisions found in the chamber's debris layer suggest this, though the evidence is not precise enough to give a duration. Days, certainly, possibly weeks. The Byzantines who sealed the room were not, in their own understanding, murderers. They were people who had solved a political problem in the cleanest way available to them, which is what everyone who seals a room always believes they are doing, which is the specific self-deception of civilizations that have developed enough sophistication to prefer indirect methods. The silence she made was her final statement, and her most last, in one, because unlike everything else she had ever said, every word spoken in the throne room, every decision rendered, every argument made, every prayer offered, the silence could not be edited out of the chronicle. You cannot record a silence, but you cannot erase it either. The silence of the sealed room persisted long after the court that created it had been consumed by the Ottoman conquest, long after the palace above it had been transformed into something else, long after the very name of the empire had passed from a living political reality into a word in the vocabulary of historians. When the workers broke through the wall in the 20th century and the silence came out of the room, they were not just breathing 800 years of trapped air, they were receiving something that had been waiting the entire time for exactly this, for a crack in the stone, for the sound of the world coming back in, for the moment when the room stopped being sealed and became once again part of the city above it. The city above it is Istanbul now. Has been Istanbul for nearly 6 centuries. The palace is a ruin and a memory, and an archaeological site and a tourist attraction, and 100 apartment buildings whose foundations rest on foundations, whose foundations rest on the floor of the room where the silence was kept. Somewhere under all of it, the gold thread is still there, woven into the sediment, too fine to see without looking carefully. The kind of thing you would walk past 1,000 times without noticing, and then notice once, and never stop noticing after that. The crown is unaccounted for. In Byzantine theology, the legitimacy that a crown conferred did not expire. The divine sanction was not time-limited. It was not dissolved by inconvenience or political necessity, or even by 800 years of darkness in a sealed room under a ruined palace in a city that no longer uses the name its founders gave it. The crown is unaccounted for. This means, in the logic of the civilization that made it, that somewhere in the deep geology of the city, the question it represents is still technically open. The silence is broken now. The room has been breathing for 100 years. But the gold thread is still there, and the question that the crown was still asking, alone in the dark in the silence that someone engineered, and someone else broke open, and no one has ever fully explained, that question has not yet received its answer. It is still wearing the crown. It is still waiting. The walls of Constantinople remember everything. They always have. They always will. There is a difference between a story that is forgotten and a story that is forgotten. A forgotten story simply fades. It loses its tellers, one by one, the people who carried it dying, or moving on or finding other things to carry. And the story thins like smoke in open air until there is nothing left of it but a faint residue in the places where it used to be. A turn of phrase, a local superstition, a habit of avoiding a certain street at a certain hour without quite remembering why. Forgotten stories are melancholy things. They go quietly. They do not resist. A forbidden story is something else entirely. A forbidden story has been looked at by someone with power and assessed as dangerous, and the assessment itself is a kind of testimony. Because powerful people do not expend the energy of prohibition on things that do not matter. When an emperor decides that a story cannot be told, when the punishment for telling it is written into law, with the same gravity as the punishment for treason or blasphemy or rebellion. What the emperor is really doing is confirming the story's importance in the loudest possible way. He is saying, this story can do something. This story, traveling from one mouth to another in the dark corridors of my palace, in the narrow streets of my capital, in the whispered exchanges of servants who have nothing else of value to trade. This story is capable of damage, and the damage it is capable of is proportional to the lengths I am willing to go to prevent it from being told. The Ming Dynasty understood this. The Ming Dynasty understood Almo, Saracide of whispers, the specific architecture of a court where knowledge was power in the most literal possible sense, and where the wrong knowledge in the wrong hands was as dangerous as a weapon. The Ming emperors ruled from the Forbidden City, and the name is not incidental, is not decorative, is not the kind of historical naming that accumulates on places over centuries of association. The name was intentional. The city was forbidden. Entry without authorization was punishable by death. The lives of the tens of thousands of people who lived and worked within its walls were governed by a system of rules so comprehensive and so precisely enforced that the Forbidden City functioned less like a palace complex and more like a separate civilization, complete with its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own social structures, its own language of status and precedence, and the thousand small signals by which the residents communicated their position within the world inside the walls. And within that world, the eunuchs were everywhere. The eunuchs of the Ming court are one of the most extraordinary and most misunderstood institutions in the history of imperial governance. At their height, there were perhaps 70,000 of them within the palace walls. 70,000 men who had submitted to castration, usually in childhood or adolescence, usually from families poor enough that the guaranteed imperial employment the operation made possible was worth the cost, sometimes performed by the men themselves in a desperate act of self-reinvention, in exchange for access to the one institution in Ming China where a man of common birth could accumulate genuine power. The eunuchs managed the emperor's household. They controlled access to his person. They supervised the inner court, the women's quarters, the private spaces of the imperial family, that no intact man except the emperor himself was permitted to enter. They ran the imperial kitchens, the imperial workshops, the imperial storehouses. They served as spies and administrators and diplomats, and sometimes as the effective rulers of the empire when the emperors they served were too young or too disengaged or too absorbed in the pleasures of the inner court to govern themselves. They also inevitably knew everything. Not the official everything. Not the everything of the court chronicles and the imperial edicts and the formal diplomatic correspondence. The other everything. The everything of people who clean the rooms and carry the food and stand outside the doors at night and hear, through walls that seem solid but are never quite as solid as the people inside them believe, the conversations that power has with itself when it thinks no one is listening. The eunuchs of the Forbidden City were the custodians of the unofficial record, the living archive of the things that the official archive had decided not to preserve, and they passed this knowledge among themselves through a system of whispered transmission that was as structured and as reliable as any formal institution, because they had understood from the beginning that the unofficial knowledge was the thing that kept them alive, that the eunuch who knew things that no one else knew was the eunuch who was difficult to eliminate, who had value that survived the political cycles that consumed everyone else. The western wing is where the story lives. The Forbidden City is oriented on a north-south axis, its major ceremonial spaces arranged in a sequence that moves from south to north, from the public to the private, from the world to the emperor. East and west are subsidiary axes, less ceremonial, more functional. The eastern sections of the complex generally associated with administrative functions, and the apartments of the crown prince. The western sections more ambiguous, more varied, containing a mix of residential quarters, ritual spaces, storage, and those rooms that every large complex accumulates over time. The rooms whose original purpose has been superseded by changing needs and changing occupants that have been reassigned and reassigned again until the segments blur together, and no one can say with certainty what a room was first built to be. The western wing in question, and it is important to be precise about the fact that this is a composite, that the story as it circulated among the eunuchs pulled from several specific locations and several specific histories and wove them into something that was more coherent and more terrible than any individual fact, was a section of residential quarters that had been sealed during the reign of one of the Middle Ming emperors, the specific reign varying depending on which version of the story you heard, which eunuch was telling it, which dark corridor you were standing in at what hour of the night. The sealing had been ordered. That much was consistent across all versions, not abandoned, not left empty in the ordinary way of rooms that fall out of use, but sealed by imperial decree, the doors nailed shut and plastered over, the windows blocked, the entries to the corridors that led to it closed and guarded. The guards were rotated frequently so that no single guard accumulated too much time and proximity to the sealed section. The rotation schedule was itself part of the decree. This was in the orders. The emperor who issued them had thought carefully about the problem of guards who stood too long outside a sealed door and began to hear things. What happened in the western wing, in the story as it circulated, was this. An imperial consort had been installed there, not one of the high-ranking consorts, not one of the women whose position was secure, and whose daily life was the subject of court record and ceremonial attention. One of the lower ranks, the Ming harem was organized into a hierarchy of extraordinary specificity, with 8 or 9 tiers of status depending on the reign, each tier with its own title and its own allowances and its own degree of access to the emperor's person. And the women at the bottom of this hierarchy lived lives of remarkable constriction, confined to their apartments for months at a time, seeing the emperor rarely or never, their existence known to the court primarily as an accounting entry, a name on a list of imperial possessions. This woman had done something. The nature of the transgression varies by version. In some tellings it was a political offense, an alliance with a faction that had subsequently fallen, which made her continued existence a walking liability. In others it was a personal offense, something that had happened in the interior of the court's domestic life that the exterior of the court had decided it could not acknowledge. In the most whispered versions, the ones told only to people who were already trusted, already implicated, already carrying enough of the unofficial knowledge that one more piece sold not significantly worsened their position. In those versions, what she had done was know something. She had been in a room, or heard something through a wall, or had access through her position to information about the emperor, or the succession, or the interior life of the imperial family that the imperial family had decided it could not allow to circulate. She had been put in the western wing, and the western wing had been sealed around her, and the official record had developed the smooth, frictionless surface that the official record always develops when someone inconvenient has been removed from it. The surface that says nothing happened here. The surface that offers no purchase to the hand that tries to push against it. And then, some time after the sealing, the interval is never specified, which is itself a detail, because a specific interval would invite a specific kind of calculation, would allow listeners to place the story in time in a way that might make it verifiable, and the story was not supposed to be verifiable. The story was supposed to live in the space where verification was impossible. The lanterns began to move. The Forbidden City used lanterns in enormous quantities, tens of thousands of them. The logistics of lighting and maintaining them a significant part of the palace's administrative infrastructure. The lanterns in the corridors near the sealed secti on of the western wing were maintained by eunuchs who had been assigned this task without being told exactly why the maintenance of these specific lanterns required the specific protocols they had been given. Never approach alone. Always carry the route in pairs. Do not stop moving. Do not look directly at the windows of the sealed section. Complete the task and leave by the designated exit. Do not speak about anything you observe until you are in the assigned reporting room and speaking to the assigned supervisor. The protocols existed because of what had been observed, not by one eunuch, but by many, over a period of years, by men who had no prior relationship with each other and no opportunity to coordinate their accounts, who came to their supervisors separately and described the same thing in language that was consistent enough to be credible and different enough to be independent. Something moved behind the windows of the sealed section, not every night, and not in the specific definable way that a person moves, not the silhouette of a figure crossing a room, not the shadow of a hand on a lantern, something more ambiguous than that. A shift in the quality of the darkness behind the blocked windows, a movement of light that should not have been moving, because the section had been sealed and there were no light sources inside it. A suggestion of presence that the men who reported it struggled to articulate precisely, and who struggled to articulate it was itself part of what made the supervisors believe them, because a man who was fabricating an account of supernatural activity would give you something cleaner, something more dramatic, something with a clearer narrative shape. The men who reported this were reporting something that resisted narrative, something that sat at the very edge of what perception could process and refused to move to where language could reach it. The death sentence attached to telling the story was not imposed immediately. It accumulated. It was not written into any single edict, but constructed gradually over several reigns, each new emperor finding the story already circulating and adding a layer of prohibition, the penalties escalating in proportion to the story's persistence, until the legal architecture around it had become so elaborate that the elaboration was itself a form of evidence, a monument to how seriously the people with power were taking a story about light moving in a window. Because the story was not simply a ghost story. The ghost story was the surface. Underneath it was a set of implications that the Ming court had very specific reasons to suppress. If the woman in the sealed wing was still there in whatever form she was still there, then the question of what had been done to her was sent, technically open. If the question was still open, then the justification for the sealing was still under examination. If the justification was still under examination, then everyone who had participated in the decision, everyone who had given the order, everyone who had executed it, everyone who had maintained the guard rotation and processed the accounting entry that removed her from the official record, all of these people were standing in a different relationship to the story than they wanted to be standing in. Not guilty, necessarily, by the legal standards of the Ming court, which had its own very specific understanding of guilt and its own very specific mechanisms for assigning it, but adjacent to something that the court had decided was not supposed to exist, implicated in a story that the court had decided could not be told. The eunuchs told it anyway. Of course they did. The eunuchs told it in the specific way that forbidden stories are always told, which is not loudly or carelessly, but with a precision and a selectivity that made the telling itself a transaction, a demonstration of trust, an exchange of vulnerability. To tell this story to someone was to give them something that could destroy you. To receive it was to become responsible for it. The story circulated this way through the eunuch community for generations, passed from the men who had been there, who had seen the light move, to the men who came after them, who had only the account but who treated the account with the same gravity that direct witnesses treat direct experience. There is a specific texture to a story that people have risked their lives to tell. You can feel it when you encounter it in the historical record, even at several removes, even filtered through centuries of transmission and the distortions of multiple translations. The story has a weight that ordinary stories do not have. It has been handled carefully. It has been held close. The people who carried it understood that they were carrying something that mattered, that the story's survival in the face of the decree that had been issued against it was itself a kind of resistance or refusal to let the official record be the only record, an insistence that the unofficial knowledge had value and deserved to persist. The eunuchs of the Ming court were not in a position to challenge imperial authority directly. Their entire existence depended on their relationship to imperial authority, and the ones who challenged it directly tended to end their careers in ways that the official record noted with brief, smooth entries and moved past without lingering. But the story was a different kind of challenge. The story said, "We know, we have always known, the sealing of the wing did not seal the knowledge. The death sentence attached to the telling did not kill the telling. The official record has its version and we have ours, and our version has been moving through this palace for generations in the dark between the lanterns, in the corridor between the post and the reporting room. In the hour before dawn when the night watch changes and two men have 30 seconds alone together in a passageway that no official record will ever note. The light in the window, the shift in the darkness, the thing that moved behind the blocked glass in a room that had been sealed by imperial decree and that should have contained nothing capable of movement. The Ming Dynasty ended in 1644 when the last emperor Chongzhen walked to the artificial hill behind the Forbidden City and hanged himself from a tree rather than surrender to the rebels who had broken through the gates of Beijing. He left a note written in his own blood on the hem of his robe. He said the ministers had shamed him. He said he died lacking the virtue to face his ancestors. He walked out of the palace he had been born into, that had been built by his predecessors over 2 centuries of accumulated imperial will, and he left it to become someone else's. The Qing dynasty that succeeded the Ming maintained the Forbidden City as its imperial residence for nearly 3 more centuries. They modified it, repaired it, adapted it to their own ceremonial needs. They did not open the western wing, whether this was because they knew what the Ming prohibition had been about and chose to respect it, or because the prohibition had outlasted its explicit justification and simply persisted as institutional habit, as the court's muscle memory of a thing that was not done is not recorded. The things that are not recorded are, in any history of the Forbidden City, the most important things. The palace is a museum now, 4 million objects, 1,800 years of accumulated imperial possession, catalogued and preserved and made available to the public that was never supposed to see any of it. The world that the walls were built to exclude now walking through the spaces that the walls were built to protect. 9,000 rooms or something near that number, the exact count varying depending on how you define a room and which sections of the complex you include in your survey. Not all 9,000 rooms are open to visitors. Some sections remain closed for reasons that the museum's official communications describe in the careful language of conservation and structural assessment and ongoing research. The language is smooth, it offers no purchase. It has the specific frictionless quality of an official explanation that has been designed to answer the question being asked while not inviting the questions underneath it. In the late afternoon, when the tour groups have thinned and the light over the Forbidden City is going the particular gold that Beijing light goes when the day is ending, and the shadows are lengthening across the courtyards in the direction of the western sections of the complex. There are sometimes guards who will, if you have been standing in the same place long enough and watching the same windows long enough, quietly suggest that you move along. Not unkindly, not with any explicit acknowledgement of why the suggestion is being made, just a gentle redirection. A hand gesture indicating the direction of the exit. A look that says, you have been watching those windows for long enough now. You have been waiting for something that you will not be able to explain if you see it and will not be able to forget if you see it, and that no official record will confirm you saw. Move along. The lanterns in that section are electric now, but the light behind the windows still moves the way the eunuchs described it. Occasionally, not always, not dramatically, just enough to make the person watching it take a step back, and then another step, and then turn and walk away quickly, not running, definitely not running, just walking with purpose toward the part of the palace that is lit and labeled and open and mapped, the part that is known, the part that the official record has echoed. Unted for, leaving the window behind them, leaving the light that should not be moving, leaving the story that was never supposed to be told, still moving, still there, still forbidden, after everything, still there. There is a moment, just before everything goes wrong, that you cannot see while you are inside it. You can only see it afterward. Looking back from the wreckage of the thing that followed, you find it waiting for you there in the past, the morning that felt slightly off, the meal that tasted strange, the dream that woke you before the dream had finished, the face in the polished metal that looked like you, but held its expression a half-second too long before it moved, when you moved. You find it waiting and you understand, in the particular way that only hindsight allows, that something was already wrong in that moment, that the disaster did not begin with the battle, or the betrayal, or the flood, or the fall, but much earlier, in something small, in something that the waking mind catalogued as insignificant, and filed away, and the dreaming mind never forgot. The ancient world paid more attention to these moments than we do. Not because the ancient world was less rational, not because the people who built Persepolis and the Parthenon and the Terracotta Army were incapable of the kind of systematic thinking that we associate with modernity, but because the ancient world had not yet developed the specific intellectual habit of treating the interior life as separate from the exterior world, the mind's perceptions as distinct from the world's realities, the thing you feel as categorically different from the thing that is. For the ancient Persian court for the world that Darius I built and ruled and understood himself to be the chosen instrument of Ahura Mazda to maintain, the supreme god of Zoroastrian theology, the Lord of wisdom, the principle of light and truth, and cosmic order, the interior and the exterior were not two things, they were one continuous fabric. They were one continuous fabric, and tears in it could appear in either direction, from outside in or inside out. And the work of the court's religious specialists was to read the surface of that fabric for signs of damage before the damage became irreparable. The mirror was one of the surfaces they read. Mirrors in the ancient Persian world were not glass. Glass mirrors came later, the technology arriving in the medieval Islamic world and spreading from there. The mirrors of Achaemenid Persia were polished metal, bronze, silver, occasionally gold for the highest ranks, beaten and worked to a reflective smoothness that could show a face clearly enough for practical use, clearly enough for the ritual uses that Persian court theology demanded, but not with the cold, flat, perfect fidelity of modern glass. A metal mirror has a warmth to it, a slight distortion, a quality of reflection that is close but not identical, that gives you back something that is recognizably you but carries within it a slight uncertainty, a slight wobble in the relationship between the face you know and the face the metal shows you. This wobble was not a flaw to be engineered away. It was understood by the people who used these objects with full theological seriousness as the space where meaning lived, because what a mirror showed you was not simply your face. A mirror showed you the intersection between you and the world that received you. It showed the moment at which your inner self, the Fravashi in Zoroastrian theology, the divine guardian spirit that accompanied every person as their higher self, their connection to Ahura Mazda, the part of you that existed before your birth and would continue after your death, met the material world and produced a visible impression. The reflection was evidence of this intersection. A healthy reflection, a clear and consistent reflection, a reflection that moved when you moved and held its expression when you held yours, was evidence that the Fravashi was present, was intact, was maintaining its relationship with the physical person it accompanied. And a reflection that was wrong was evidence of the opposite. The djinn, and here we are moving between theological systems, between the Zoroastrian cosmology of the Persian court and the older, deeper, less systematized world of Persian folk belief that existed beneath and around the official theology the way folk belief always exists beneath official theology, too persistent and too widely held to be eliminated, too useful to be entirely ignored, The djinn were not the benevolent wish-granters of later popular conception. They were something considerably more ambiguous, considerably more dangerous, entities of considerable power that occupied the spaces between the human and the divine, that were capable of both assistance and destruction, and that made their choices according to their own logic, which was not human logic and did not take human welfare as its primary organizing principle. Among the many things a djinn was capable of was theft. Not the theft of objects, which was too straightforward, too easily remedied. The theft of essence. The theft of the thing that made a person specifically and irreducibly themselves. The reflection, the shadow, the name, the luck, the favor of the divine that was expressed in the visible, material success of a mind, material success of a person's life. These were the things that mattered. These were the things that a sufficiently powerful djinn could take, and the taking of them was not immediately visible, in the way that the theft of a horse or a gold cup was immediately visible. The taking of a reflection looked, from the outside, exactly like nothing had changed. The person still moved. The person still spoke and ate and gave orders and received tribute. The person still appeared, to every external observer, to be exactly who they had always been. Only the mirror knew. Darius I, Darius the Great, as history has named him, the third king of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the man who expanded Persian power to its greatest extent, who built Persepolis, who organized the empire into the satrapy system that became the administrative model for every large territorial empire that followed, who completed and extended the royal road that connected the empire's extremities to its center, who was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most consequential rulers in human history, was a man who had learned, very early in his reign, that power was inseparable from divine favor, and divine favor was not guaranteed. He had come to the throne through violence, not inherited it cleanly, not received it through the unambiguous operation of succession, but seized it in the chaos following the death of Cambyses' text, fighting his way to the kingship through a series of battles and suppressions that he commemorated on the great cliff face at Behistun, in an inscription so massive and so carefully multilingual, carved in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, that it was intended to be legible to every literate person in the empire and to proclaim, in letters 10 feet high, that Ahura Mazda had chosen him, had given him the kingdom, had stood beside him in the battles through which he had secured it. The Behistun inscription is one of the great documents of the ancient world. It is also, reading between its enormous letters, the record of a man who understood that his legitimacy required constant maintenance, that the claim of divine favor was not made once and then secured forever, but had to be continuously demonstrated, continuously renewed, that the moment the demonstration faltered, the moment the renewal failed, every vassal king and every ambitious general and every suppressed rebellion that was waiting for exactly this signal would know that the signal had come. He was, in short, a man who could not afford to lose, and the mirror told him that he was going to, the specific mirror in question. And the story exists in the layer of Persian historical tradition that sits between the contemporary record and the fully elaborated legendary tradition, and the sources that are neither official chronicle nor pure mythology, but the sediment between them, where the most interesting historical material always accumulates, was part of the ritual equipment of the court, one of the objects used by the priests and specialists who monitored the spiritual condition of the king and the empire. Every morning, the king's reflection was examined, not by the king himself. This was not a private act of vanity, but a public ritual of assessment, performed in a specific context with specific witnesses, the results reported to specific channels to specific advisors. The reflection was the daily readout of the king's spiritual condition, the visible evidence of the Fravashi's continued presence and the djinn's continued absence on the morning before the campaign that would bring Darius to his greatest defeat. And the campaign in question is the Scythian expedition, the disastrous push north of the Danube in approximately 513 BCE, when the largest army Persia had ever assembled was led into the vast emptiness of the Scythian steppe, and simply worn down, not defeated in battle but exhausted and bewildered by an enemy that refused to stand and fight, that retreated endlessly before the Persian advance, burning its own pasture land, filling its own wells, giving the Persian army nothing to engage and nothing to sustain itself on, until Darius was forced to withdraw in a retreat that he framed as a strategic decision, but that everyone who participated in it understood as a failure of a kind that the Achaemenid Empire had not experienced before. On that morning, the mirror showed something wrong. The accounts differ in their specifics, as accounts at this distance always do. Some say the reflection moved a fraction of a second behind the body, that Darius raised his hand, and the reflection raised its hand afterward, in the manner of a copy rather than a simultaneous. Some say the reflection's face held an expression that Darius's face was not making, something between blankness and grief, the expression of a person receiving news they have been expecting and dreading. Some say simply that the priests who examined the reflection saw in it what trained eyes see when the thing they are trained to look for is present, and that what they saw made them go immediately to the senior religious advisors of the court, bypassing the usual reporting channels, because what they had seen was urgent in a way that the usual channels were not designed to convey. What happened next is the part of the story that the official record smooths over with the specific frictionless surface that official records always develop around things that the official narrative cannot accommodate. The campaign proceeded, the army assembled, the crossing of the Hellespont was made, the bridge of boats that Darius's engineers constructed to move the largest land force the ancient world had yet seen across from Asia to Europe. All of this was documented, commemorated, understood as the expression of the empire's irresistible momentum. But the mirror was buried, before the army moved, before the crossing, in the private rituals of the inner court, in the space between the official ceremony and the campaign's departure. The mirror was wrapped in cloth that had been prepared with specific materials, the wrapping performed by specialists, whose role in the court was precisely this: the management of objects that had become dangerous, the containment of things that could not be destroyed because destroying them would release what they contained but could not be left in open use, because leaving them in open use would compound the damage. The wrapped mirror was placed face down, always face down, because a mirror placed face up continued to receive, continued to pull the world toward its surface, continued to perform the function that had made it dangerous, while a mirror placed face down was closed, was turned away, was in some sense refusing to look, and buried in a location that was recorded only in the specialized knowledge of the people responsible for such things, not in the earth of Persepolis, not in the ceremonial center of the empire, not in the place where the concentrated spiritual power of the court was focused, where a buried, dangerous object would be like a splinter working itself deeper toward the heart. Somewhere else, somewhere at a sufficient remove, somewhere that the mirror's continued existence underground could not influence the ongoing life of the palace above it. The location was kept by the specialists and passed to their successors, because you needed to know where it was, even if you never intended to open it, because a buried dangerous thing that you have lost track of is considerably more dangerous than a buried dangerous thing you know the location of. The expedition failed, not catastrophically. Darius returned. The army returned. The empire continued. The satrapy system kept functioning. The royal road kept carrying messages and goods and soldiers. But it failed in the specific way that failures are most damaging to the people they happen to, which is to say, it failed in the way that confirmed what had already been suspected. The djinn had been there in the mirror that morning. The reflection had shown what the reflection showed when the Fervashi's connection was compromised, when something had gotten between the king and the divine favor that was the foundation of his legitimacy. The expedition failed and the failure retroactively confirmed the mirror's testimony, and the mirror's testimony retroactively confirmed the failure. And the story sealed itself around both of them in the way that stories sealed themselves around the things they are designed to explain. Because this is what the mirror story was doing. Underneath the theology, underneath the cosmology of djinn and fravashi, and the divine favor of Ahura Mazda, it was doing the same thing that every culture's supernatural explanatory framework does when confronted with the failure of an apparently invincible power. It was preserving the coherence of the system. Darius was great. Darius was chosen. Darius was the instrument of Ahura Mazda's will on earth. The Behistun inscription said so in 3 languages on a cliff face, visible for miles, and Darius had failed. These 2 facts needed to coexist, needed to be made compatible, needed to be reconciled in a way that preserved the framework, rather than collapsing it. And the mirror gave you the reconciliation. Darius had not failed because he was not great. He had not failed because Ahura Mazda had withdrawn favor. He had failed because something had intervened between the greatness and its expression. Something had gotten into the space between the king and his reflection. Something had taken the thing that was supposed to protect him and left him exposed. The greatness was intact, the divine choice was intact. The divine choice was intact, the framework was intact. Only the mirror had been wrong, and the mirror was buried 9. Face down, sealed away, unable to do further damage. This is what forbidden objects are for. Every culture that has ever developed a theology of power has also developed a theology of dangerous objects, objects that have absorbed too much of something, that have become too saturated with significance, that have passed from the realm of tools into the realm of things that act on their own, that have become agents rather than instruments. The buried mirror is the Akhenaten version of a universal human solution to the problem of an object that has witnessed something that cannot be witnessed without consequence. You do not destroy it. Destruction is too final, too absolute, too much of a statement about the thing's nature and your relationship to it. You bury it. You put it in the ground where it cannot see and cannot be seen, where the face is turned away from the world that it reflects, where the djinn that the specialist said was visible in it on that specific morning has no surface to inhabit. On that specific morning has no surface to inhabit, no interface through which to extend its influence into the ongoing life of the court above. You bury it, and you remember where it is, and you do not go back. Persepolis was burned by Alexander in 330 BCE, 180 years after Darius built it, and approximately 183 years after the Scythian expedition. Whether the burning was deliberate policy or Nican accident is a question that has been debated since antiquity and will not be resolved here. What is not debated is that the burning was total. The great Apadana, with its processional friezes showing the tributary peoples of the empire bearing their gifts to the king, the treasury, the libraries, the accumulated material of a civilization that had organized itself around permanence, around stone, around the inscription of its own significance on surfaces designed to last 10,000 years. The specialists who kept the knowledge of the mirror's location died or fled, or were killed in the decades of warfare that followed Alexander's conquest. The knowledge they kept died with them, or was scattered so thoroughly in the disruption of the court that it could not be reassembled. Somewhere in the earth of what is now Fars province, in southern Iran, in the region that was the heartland of the Achaemenid world, the mirror is still there, face down, in the darkness that it was given, and that has not been interrupted in 2.5 millennia. The djinn, the tradition says, cannot leave an object it has entered as long as the object is buried face down in the proper way, with the proper preparations. It is held there, contained, not destroyed. You cannot destroy it, a djinn, which is why you bury the thing it inhabits rather than smashing it. Why destroying the mirror would be the worst possible response, would shatter the container and release what is inside it into the world, without form, without location, without even the shape of the object to define and limit it. 2,500 years is a long time to hold something, long enough that the thing being held has had time to understand its situation completely, long enough that it knows, with the particular knowledge of the very old and very patient, exactly what is above it. The layers of soil and conquest, and subsequent civilization, the Seleucid layer, and the Parthian layer, and the Sasanian layer, and the Islamic layer, and the Islamic layer, and the modern layer, each one pressing down on the one beneath it, adding weight, adding distance between the mirror and the surface where it could, if it were face up, see the sky. It is face down. It has always been face down. It has always been face down. But face down only means it cannot look up. It can still look at the earth beneath it. It can still reflect. And what it has been reflecting for 2,500 years, in the dark, in the face-down direction that its burial prescribed, is the deep interior of the world, the layers beneath it, the absolute darkness of the ground, the place where no light has ever reached and no face has ever looked, and no fravashi has ever cast a shadow. The djinn knows this darkness now, the way you know a room you have lived in for a lifetime. The archaeologists know, the way you know a room you have lived in for a lifetime. Orking and Fars province are careful. They are careful in the way that people are careful when they work in ground that has been accumulating significance for thousands of years, in ground where any turn of the spade might reveal something that the earth has been keeping for reasons the earth has not explained. They are careful and methodical and scientific, and they do not, as a professional matter, organize their work around the cosmological frameworks of the civilization they are studying. But there are stories they tell each other, late in the season, when the dig is winding down, and the site is being covered again against the winter, stories about specific locations where the ground feels different, where the instruments read strangely, where the careful methodology of the archaeologist encounters something that the methodology does not have a category for, where the earth does not want to be opened, where something below is keeping very still, where the darkness, if you put your ear to the ground, has a quality that darkness in other places does not have, more like the memory of a sound, the residue of a reflection that was witnessed once, on a morning that changed the world, and that has been held in the face-down dark ever since, waiting with a patience that makes the patience of the buried empress and the patience of the sealed room and the patience of all the other waiting things in all the other dark places seem young. The mirror does not need to be opened. It is already showing something. It has been showing it for 2,500 years. Whatever is down there in the direction it is facing has been looking back at it for just as long. Do not dig there. Do not go looking for the place where the instruments read strangely. Do not put your ear to the ground. Some objects were buried because what they showed was too dangerous to leave in the light. The light is exactly what they are still being kept from. Leave them in the dark. Leave them face down. Leave the djinn its room. It has made itself very comfortable. It is not waiting to be released. It stopped waiting for that a very long time ago. Now it is simply waiting, the way that things wait when they have all the time there is and nothing left to lose. Quietly, completely, in the dark, in the direction that the mirror cannot stop looking. Sleep now. The ground above it is very still tonight. It always is. There is a kind of ending that does not announce itself. Not the ending with fire and armies, and the dramatic collapse of walls that have stood for centuries. Not the ending that gives you a date to put in a textbook and a battle to name a chapter after. Not the ending that arrives with the full theatrical weight of something that knows it, is historic and forms accordingly. Not that kind of ending. The other kind. The kind that happens in an ordinary room on an ordinary evening, while the rest of the world is doing something else. While the merchants in the forum are adding up their accounts and the soldiers on the frontier are eating their evening meal, and the farmers in the fields outside the city are watching the light go from the sky in the particular way it goes in late summer in northern Italy, golden and slow and indifferent to everything that is happening in the ruins of the powerful. The kind of ending that is only recognized as an ending afterward. The kind that, while it is happening, looks almost exactly like nothing. This is how the Western Roman Empire ended. Not with a bang, not even with a whimper, which at least has sound in it, at least disturbs the air. It ended with the specific silence of a document being signed in a room that most people would not have been able to find on a map, in a city that had only been the capital of the Western Empire for a few decades, because the actual capital had been moved away from Rome itself in 402 CE, moved to Ravenna on the northeastern coast of Italy, because Ravenna was surrounded by marshes and marshes were defensible, and by 402 CE defensibly had become the primary architectural criterion for the Western Empire's administrative center, which tells you something about how 402 CE felt to the people living inside it. The document was an instrument of abdication. The room was in Ravenna. The year was 476 CE, and the person who signed it, or who had it signed on his behalf, or who was present while it was signed by the people who had arranged for the signing. The historical record is imprecise about the mechanics in a way that is itself significant, in the way that records are always imprecise about the mechanics of things that the people making the records found embarrassing. Was a boy. His name was Romulus Augustulus. History has given him a diminutive, and the diminutive has stuck. Augustulus, little Augustus, little emperor, the suffix that Latin applied to things that were smaller or lesser versions of the thing they were named after, applied here to the name of the man who had founded the empire, whose last nominal ruler this boy was pretending to be, little Augustus, the name of the greatest Roman who ever lived, with a suffix that turned it into something you might call a child's toy, or a puppy, or a coin that was worth less than it claimed. He was somewhere between 14 and 16 years old. The sources disagree on the precise age, which is itself a small ghost. A child whose birth was not considered important enough to record with the accuracy that would later be needed to reconstruct it. His father was Orestes, a Roman general of barbarian origin, which combination Roman general, barbarian origin, was by 475 CE so unremarkable as to require no comment, because the Western Roman army had been drawing on barbarian recruits and barbarian commanders for so long that the distinction between Roman military and barbarian military had become largely nominal. Orestes had placed his son on the throne in 475 CE by the simple expedient of deposing the previous emperor, Julius Nepos, which was itself unremarkable because deposing emperors was by 475 CE the primary mechanism by which Western Roman emperors were created and removed. The Western Empire in its final decades was not governing. It was being governed through the way weather is channeled through a landscape, taking the shape of whatever container it passed through without being contained by it. The actual power was held by the military commanders, the men who controlled the armies that were the only thing the empire still unambiguously possessed, and the emperors they installed and removed were administrative fictions, legal necessities, the names that needed to appear on documents for the documents to carry the weight of Roman law, which still meant something, which was still the framework within which even the barbarian commanders who controlled everything preferred to operate, because the alternative was admitting that the framework had collapsed, and that the admission was more destabilizing than the fiction. Romulus Augustulus was the fiction's final iteration, the last name on the last documents, the last boy in the purple. The man who removed him was named Odoacer. He was the commander of the barbarian federates, the Germanic soldiers, primarily Herulians and Scyrians and Rugians, who formed the core of what remained of the Western Roman army. Herulians of the Western Roman army, who had been promised grants of land in Italy as payment for their service, and who had been promised this for long enough that the promise had curdled into grievance, and the grievance had organized itself into something that looked very much like a political movement. Odoacer led this movement to Ravenna in August of 476 CE, and Orestes was captured and killed, and the boy emperor was left alone in the palace with whatever understanding a 14-year-old who has been an emperor for less than a year has of what is about to happen. What happened was not what usually happened. What usually happened when a Roman emperor was deposed was one of the range of outcomes that the Western Empire had normalized over its final century. Exile if you were lucky, blinding if you were considered potentially troublesome, but too politically connected to kill, death if neither of the first two options seemed sufficient. The calculus was political, and it was usually quick because uncertainty about the fate of a deposed emperor created the kind of instability that the people doing the deposing were trying to eliminate. Odoacer looked at the boy and made a different calculation. He sent him away, not to Constantinople, not to the Eastern Court where Romulus's very existence would be a complication in the delicate question of imperial succession and legitimacy that the East was already navigating carefully, not to Rome, where his presence would be a focal point for any faction that wanted a Roman figurehead, to Campania, to a place called Castellum Luculunum, which had been the extraordinarily luxurious seaside villa of the first-century Roman general Lucullus, the man whose appetite for extravagance had given the word Lucullus to the English language, and which had been converted over the intervening centuries into a fortress, sitting on a promontory above the Bay of Naples, with the particular combination of beauty and impregnability that made it simultaneously a paradise and a prison. Odoacer gave the boy a pension. This is the detail that historians return to with a mixture of genuine puzzlement and something that functions like relief, because it is so unexpected, because it fits so poorly with everything else about the political violence of the period, because a pension is such a specifically administrative, such a specifically Roman response to the problem of a deposed MP, that it almost makes you laugh. The barbarian commander who had just ended the Western Roman Empire sat down and worked out an annual income for the boy he had taken the empire from. A comfortable income, enough to maintain a household appropriate to someone of imperial background, and he sent the boy to the most beautiful place in Italy to live on it. Why? The question does not have a definitive answer in the sources. The sources give you the facts, the pension, the villa, the departure, without providing the reasoning, and the reasoning is where everything interesting lies. Some historians argue simple pragmatism. Romulus was young, interesting lives. Some historians argue simple pragmatism. Romulus was young, was clearly not the power behind his own throne, was the son of the man who had actually been Odoacer's rival, and who was already dead, and killing a child for the crime of having been placed on a throne he had not sought was an act of unnecessary brutality that would cost more in political terms than it saved. Some argue that Odoacer, who was about to do something that had no precedent in the history of the Roman world, rule Italy not as an emperor, not even as a nominal emperor's general, but simply as himself, as a king of his own making, needed to signal that he was operating within some framework of civilized norms, and letting the child live was that signal. Some argue there was something else, something that the sources do not recount. Third, because the sources were written by people who were navigating the same political currents they were describing, and who had reasons of their own for leaving certain things unrecorded. The boy went to Campania, and then, in the way that the historical record handles things it cannot account for, he disappears. Not immediately, not dramatically. He is there in the sources for a little while. A letter survives written to Odoacer by Romulus himself, or by someone writing in his name, requesting an increasing in his pension, and Odoacer apparently granted this, and for a moment you have a picture of something almost absurdly domestic. The man who ended the Western Roman Empire processing pension adjustment requests from the boy he ended it for, the two of them connected by this thread of administrative correspondence in the villa above the bay, the empire gone and this small human transaction persisting in its absence, like the last ember of a fire that has otherwise gone completely out, and then nothing. No further letters. No further references, no record of a death, no record of a burial, no tomb that has been identified, no funerary inscription, no document recording the disposition of his estate, no account of what happened to the household that his pension was maintaining. The sources that continue to record events in Italy after 476 CE, and there are sources, the period is not undocumented. Odoacer's reign and the subsequent Ostrogothic kingdom of Theodoric are recorded in reasonable detail. Simply do not mention him again. He is there and then he is not there, and the transition between the two states is unmarked, as if the record itself decided that the question of what happened to Romulus Augustulus after his pension was adjusted was not a question worth answering. This is strange. Not unprecedented. The ancient and medieval record is full of people who disappear from it without explanation, but strange in this specific case because of who the person is. This is the last Western Roman emperor. This is the name at the end of the longest unbroken list of rulers in the Western world's political history, a list that begins with Octavian Augustus in 27 BCE and runs for 500 years to this boy in a villa above the Bay of Naples. The end of that list should generate a record. The death of that list's final entry should be documented with the same care and the same gravity that every other significant transition in late Roman history was documented. The silence around it is not the silence of unimportance. It is the silence of something that was either not witnessed, or witnessed and not recorded, or recorded and subsequently lost. And all three of these possibilities carry their own implications and their own shadows. Some historians place his death in the early 480s CE, within a few years of the abdication, inferring it from the pension records ceasing and from the subsequent use of castellum luclunum for other purposes. The inference is reasonable. It is also, and this is the important thing, only an inference. The death of the last Western Roman emperor is inferred. It is not documented. It did not generate the record that a death of that significance should have generated, and the absence of the record is the thing that the silence is made of, the thing that has been accumulating in the space where the documentation should be for 1,500 years. No body was ever found. No grave was ever found. No grave was ever identified. No inscription marking the end of the last Western emperor has ever been discovered in the archaeological layers around Castellum Lucullanum, which is now the island of Megarede off the coast of Naples, which is now surmounted by the Castel dell'Ovo, the castle of the egg, named after a legend that Virgil placed a magical egg in the castle's foundations, and that the fate of Naples depends on the egg remaining intact, because Naples is a city that understood from very early on that the most important things are the ones hidden in foundations, the things underneath that you cannot see, but that everything above depends on. The castle sits on the promontory where the villa stood. The bay is still extraordinary, illy beautiful. The light in the late afternoon does what light does over the Tyrrhenian Sea, which is to become something almost unreasonably golden, something that makes the water look like it has been poured rather than placed, something that makes the fortress above it look less like a military installation and more like something dreamed. Somewhere in the layers beneath the castle, beneath the medieval fortifications and the Norman additions and the Angevin modifications and the Spanish renovations and the centuries of continuous use that have pressed the earlier layers deeper and deeper into the rock of the promontory, somewhere in all of that, if the inference is correct, if the boy died here as the records suggest, without stating, there is the physical residue of the end of the Western Roman Empire, not a monument, not a tomb with an inscription, just a layer, just the ordinary archaeological evidence of a life that ended in a particular place, indistinguishable from the evidence of any other life that ended in any other place, unannounced and unrecorded, and pressed into the rock of a promontory above the most beautiful bay in Italy. But the inference might be wrong. And it is the wrongness of the inference, the possibility that the inference is wrong, that the story lives inside. Because if Romulus Augustulus did not die in the early 480 SCE, If the pension record C said for some other reason. If the silence in the sources is not the silence of an unrecorded death but the silence of something else, of a continued life, of a removal to somewhere that the sources were not watching, of a deliberate disappearance from the record that was not the same as a disappearance from the world, then the boy emperor is somewhere, not alive. Not now, not after 1500 years, but somewhere in the sense that the body is somewhere, that the grave is somewhere, that the end of the story is somewhere in the physical world waiting to be found, that the last Western Roman emperor has a location even if the location is unknown, that the silence in the record is not the same as the absence of the thing the record failed to record. He would be, by the standards of his own world, completely unknown to the people around him. The pension gone, the title stripped, the purple taken back, the name that had briefly been the most important name in the Western world, reduced to the name of an older man living quietly in a place where no one asked too many questions about who he was before. Roman Italy in the late 5th and early 6th centuries was full of such people, the displaced and the demoted, the men and women who had been adjacent to power during the empire's final convulsions, and who had survived the convulsions by becoming invisible, by learning the specific skill of people who have had very visible lives and then very suddenly need to stop being visible. He had learned this skill at 14, in the most extreme possible way. He had been the most visible person in the Western world, and then he had been sent to a villa and told, implicitly but absolutely, that his continued survival depended on never being visible again. 14 is young enough to learn this lesson completely, young enough to build a life around it, young enough that by the time you are 30, 40, 50, the life you built around invisibility is simply your life, and the boy in the purple is something that happened to someone else. Something so distant and so strange that it feels less like a memory and more like a story you were told once about a person who shared your name. Rome took a long time to fall. This is the thing that the textbook date of 476 CE obscures, the thing that the clean story of the last emperor and the document of abdication smooths over in the interest of narrative tidiness. Rome did not fall on the day Romulus Augustulus signed the document. Rome had been falling for 100 years before that day, and continued falling for 100 years after it. The city, and the idea and the infrastructure and the law all declining at different rates, in different ways in different places, some of it lasting far longer than anyone would have predicted and some of it gone before anyone noticed it was going. The aqueducts kept running for decades after 476 CE. The law kept being applied, in modified forms, in the successor kingdoms that occupied the former empire's territory, because the barbarian kings who replaced the Roman emperors found Roman law useful and adopted it rather than replacing it. The Latin language kept evolving, kept being spoken, kept slowly becoming the daughter languages that would eventually becoming Italian and French and Spanish and Portuguese and Romanian, the children of the empire outlasting the empire by millennia. The church kept the administrative structure of the imperial system long after the imperial system itself was gone, organized its provinces on the model of the Roman provinces, used Latin as its official language, preserved in its institutional memory the shape of a civilization that had officially ended. The empire ended in silence. The empire also never quite ended. These two things are both true, and the tension between them is where the history lives, where the meaning lives, where the story that is not finished being told continues to generate new chapters in the form of everything that came after, every European state that claimed the Roman inheritance, every legal system built on Roman foundations, every language that is Latin's grandchild, every city whose street plan still follows the grid that Roman surveyors established 2,000 years ago. And somewhere in all of that, in the long, slow, never quite finished falling of the thing that was Rome, a boy sat on a promontory above the Bay of Naples and watched a light do what light does over the Tyrrhenian Sea in the late afternoon, golden and slow and indifferent to everything that is happening in the rooms of the powerful. He had been the most powerful person in the Western world. He was 14 years old. He had a pension and a view, and a name that was simultaneously the greatest name in Roman history and the diminutive form of it, the little version, the smaller echo of the enormous original. And then the record stopped, and the silence began, and the silence has been accumulating ever since, layer upon layer, in the space where the documentation should be. In the gap between the last pension record and the first reference to Castellum Lucullinum being used for some other year pose, in the 1500 years between the moment the record stopped and this moment, now, when the night is very quiet and the empire that the boy briefly represented has been gone for so long that the word gone no longer seems adequate to describe it. He is somewhere. The ending is somewhere. Not lost, not destroyed, not erased in the way that names are erased from Egyptian stone or empresses are erased from Byzantine chronicles, just unfound, just waiting in the ground beneath a castle on a promontory above a bay, where the light is still extraordinary in the late afternoon, where the water still looks like it has been poured rather than placed, where the rock still holds whatever it has been, holding since a boy arrived here with a pension and a view, and no future that anyone thought worth recording. The empire ended in silence. The silence is still going. It is very deep now. It has had 1500 years to become what silence becomes when nothing interrupts it. When the thing it surrounds is never found. When the question it holds is never answered. When the question it holds is never answered. When the last page of the longest story the Western world has ever told is still turned face down in the dark somewhere, still waiting for the hand that will turn it over. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight the bay is dark, and the castle is lit, and the water is doing what water does when the wind moves over it, and somewhere, in the rock beneath everything that has been built on top of everything that was built on top of the place where the boy sat watching the light go gold and slow. The empire is still ending. It never quite finished. It is still the quietest sound you have never heard. Sleep now. The silence will still be here when you wake. It has always been here. It will always be here. The last emperor is still waiting to be found. Settle in. Pull the blanket a little closer. We have a long, quiet night ahead of us. Tighter,